everyone. Welcome back to our podcast. And a huge thank you to Jet Off AI for fueling our creativity and enthusiasm, so we can bring you the most fun and informative content possible. We're super to dive into our first topic, and we're going to explore two amazing countries that might just change your travel plans, or even your life. So, let's get started and see which country will be your next adventure.
What's up, folks? We're back, and we've got a treat for you today. As some of you might know, our previous episode was all about the crazy things we experienced on a road trip. Mira here managed to get lost in a small town, and I had to rescue her with my exceptional navigation skills. She's still laughing about it, but I'm pretty sure she's plotting her revenge.
Oh, Leo, you're such a hero. But let's get serious for a moment. Today, we're going to compare two beautiful countries, Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. Both countries have their unique charm, and we'll explore everything from their cultures, climates, and economies to their stunning natural beauty and delicious cuisine.
That's right, Mira. And, as always, we'll be answering all the questions that are on your mind. Whether you're planning a trip, moving to one of these countries, or even considering marrying someone from there, we've got you covered. Our podcast will be your comprehensive guide to help you make informed decisions.
So, let's get started. Mozambique is a country located in southeastern Africa, with a rich history and culture that dates back to the ancient times. From its beautiful beaches to its vibrant cities, Mozambique has a lot to offer. But what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? This tiny island nation in the Caribbean is known for its stunning natural beauty, with mountains, beaches, and rainforests.
Ah, Saint Kitts and Nevis, the land of sugar cane and sunshine. Who wouldn't want to visit a place with such a warm and welcoming atmosphere? But what about the costs? Is it expensive to live in Saint Kitts and Nevis? Or can you find affordable options?
Great question. Leo, let's dive into the costs of living in both countries. Mozambique has a relatively low cost of living, especially when it comes to accommodation and food. The country is still recovering from a civil war, and infrastructure can be a challenge.
That's true, Mira. But what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? Don't they have a reputation for being one of the most expensive Caribbean islands?
Ah, yes, they do. But it's not all bad news. With some careful planning and research, you can find affordable options for accommodation and living expenses. And let's not forget about the beautiful beaches and stunning natural scenery.
You're selling it to me, Mira. But seriously, what about the cultural differences between the two countries? How do they compare in terms of language, customs, and traditions?
Excellent question. Leo, Mozambique has a rich cultural heritage, with a mix of African, Portuguese, and Arab influences. The country has a strong tradition of music, dance, and art, and the people are known for their warm hospitality.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? What can you tell us about their culture and traditions?
Saint Kitts and Nevis has a unique cultural identity, shaped by its history as a British colony. The country has a strong tradition of cricket, and the people are known for their love of music, especially calypso and reggae.
I can already imagine the music festivals. But let's get back to the serious stuff. What about the economy and job market in both countries?
Great question. Leo, Mozambique has a growing economy, driven by its natural resources, such as coal, iron, and gas. The country is also investing in infrastructure development, including roads, bridges, and ports.
That's impressive. Mira, and what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? What can you tell us about their economy and job market?
Saint Kitts and Nevis has a small but thriving economy, driven by its tourism industry and financial services sector. The country is also known for its sugar cane production and export.
Sugar cane and sunshine. Who would want to live in a place like that? But let's get back to the serious stuff. What about the education system in both countries?
Ah, great question. Leo, Mozambique has a well-established education system, with a mix of public and private schools. The country has a strong tradition of education, and many Mozambicans have gone on to become successful professionals.
Well, that's impressive. And what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? What can you tell us about their education system?
Ah, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a strong education system, with a focus on primary and secondary education. The country has a high literacy rate, and many Saint Kitts and Nevisians have gone on to become successful professionals.
I think we've covered a lot of ground so far, Mira. But let's get back to the fun stuff. What about the food in both countries? Are there any must-try dishes or cuisine?
Ah, great question. Leo, Mozambique has a delicious cuisine, with a mix of African, Portuguese, and Arab influences. Some must-try dishes include peri-peri chicken, lotapo, and fungi.
Peri-peri chicken sounds amazing. And what about St. Kitts and Nevis? What can you tell us about their cuisine?
Ah, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a unique cuisine, shaped by its history as a British colony. Some must-try dishes include conch fritters, saltfish, and roti.
Conch fritters sound delicious. And let's get back to the serious stuff. What about the healthcare system in both countries?
Ah, great question. Leo, Mozambique has a well-established healthcare system, with a mix of public and private hospitals. The country has a strong tradition of healthcare, and many Mozambicans have access to quality medical care.
Wow, that's impressive. And what about St. Kitts and Nevis? What can you tell us about their healthcare system?
Ah, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a well-established healthcare system, with a focus on primary and secondary care. The country has a high standard of living, and many Saint Kitts and Nevisians have access to quality medical care.
I think we've covered a lot of ground so far. Mira, but let's get back to the fun stuff. What about the nightlife in both countries?
So, let's dive into the world of general safety and crime rates in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. I'm sure our listeners in these countries would agree that a safe environment is essential for daily life.
Absolutely. Mira, while both countries have their unique challenges, they also share some interesting similarities. For instance, in Mozambique, petty crimes like pickpocketing and theft are common in tourist areas.
That's true, Leo. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, I heard that petty theft is also a concern, especially in areas with high foot traffic. But what's interesting is that both countries have a strong focus on community policing.
Ah, yes. Community policing is a crucial aspect of keeping communities safe. In Mozambique, the police work closely with local communities to prevent and investigate crimes. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, the police also engage with the public to build trust and prevent crime.
That's great to hear, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that having a strong relationship between law enforcement and the community is essential for maintaining public safety. But what about violent crimes? How do these countries compare in terms of homicide rates?
Well, Mira, it's kind of like a thing. According to the data, Mozambique has a higher homicide rate compared to St. Kitts and Nevis. However, it's essential to note that crime rates can vary greatly depending on the region and city.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm curious, have you heard of any notable cases or incidents in these countries that might give us a better understanding of the crime situation?
Actually, Mira, I've heard that in Mozambique, there have been some incidents of armed robbery in major cities like Maputo. However, the police have been working to improve security measures and engage with the community to prevent such crimes.
That's concerning. Leo. But it's also heartening to hear that the police are taking proactive steps to address the issue. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, I've heard that there's a strong focus on addressing domestic violence and abuse.
Yes, that's correct. Mira, the government and organizations in Saint Kitts and Nevis are working together to raise awareness and provide support for victims of domestic violence.
That's fantastic to hear. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that addressing domestic violence is essential for creating a safe and healthy community. But what about the role of technology in preventing and solving crimes in these countries?
That's a great question. Mira, in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, technology is being used to enhance public safety. For example, in Mozambique, the police are using social media to engage with the public and provide information on crime prevention and safety tips.
That's a great example. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips or advice on how to stay safe in these countries. So, let's wrap up this section on general safety and crime rates in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Absolutely. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and information we've shared.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever thought about how politics shape our experiences as expats in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Mira, you know I'm always on the lookout for the absurd side of politics. In Mozambique, for instance, the government has made significant efforts to decentralize power and involve local communities in decision-making processes. It's like they're saying, hey, we trust you to run your own show.
That's fascinating. Leo, and speaking of trust, I'm sure our listeners living in Saint Kitts and Nevis would agree that the government's focus on community development has fostered a strong sense of social harmony. It's almost as if they're saying, we're all in this together.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's what makes Saint Kitts and Nevis such a great example of a country that values social cohesion. But, let's be real, politics can be messy, and sometimes it's hard to separate fact from fiction. I mean, have you seen the latest YouTube video from Jet Off? Hey, it's like they're trying to break down the complex issues into bite-sized pieces.
Leo, you always know how to bring a smile to my face. But seriously, I think it's great that we're discussing the importance of social harmony in these two countries. And speaking of harmony, have you ever noticed how beautiful the music is in Mozambique? It's like a fusion of traditional and modern styles.
Oh, Mira, you're always so enthusiastic about music. But I think what you're saying is that Mozambique's cultural diversity is a strength. And that's something that Saint Kitts and Nevis can learn from. I mean, who wouldn't want to celebrate their heritage with a good old-fashioned party?
Exactly. Leo, and I think that's what makes Saint Kitts and Nevis so unique. They have this amazing blend of Caribbean and African influences that create a truly vibrant culture. It's like a never-ending festival.
Mira, you're making me want to pack my bags and move to Saint Kitts and Nevis right now. But, seriously, I think what you're saying is that the government's efforts to preserve cultural heritage have paid off. And I think that's something that Mozambique can learn from.
Absolutely. And speaking of learning, I'm curious about what our listeners think about the role of education in promoting social harmony in these two countries. Do you think it's a key factor? Or is there something else at play?
Mira, you always know how to ask the tough questions. But, seriously, I think education is a crucial part of promoting social harmony. And I think that's why Saint Kitts and Nevis has made such a big investment in their education system. It's like they're saying, we want to empower our citizens to be active participants in their communities.
That's so true. Leo. And I think that's why Mozambique's focus on vocational training has been so successful. It's like they're saying, we want to equip our citizens with the skills they need to succeed in the modern economy.
Exactly, Mira. And I think that's what makes these two countries such great examples of how politics can shape social harmony. It's all about finding that delicate balance between preserving cultural heritage and promoting economic development.
Leo, you always know how to bring it all together. And I think that's what makes this podcast so special. We get to explore these complex issues in a way that's both informative and entertaining. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Leah.
Nero, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And to our listeners, I'm curious, what do you think about the role of politics in shaping social harmony in these two countries? Do you have any stories or experiences to share? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to check out Jet-Off AI for more insights like this.
Dive into the economic conditions and cost of living in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. I'm curious. Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of these two countries in terms of economy?
Well, Mira, I'd say Mozambique has a relatively underdeveloped economy, with a focus on agriculture, mining, and tourism. Saint Kitts and Nevis, on the other hand, has a more established economy, with a strong focus on tourism and financial services.
That's a great point. Leo! And I think it's worth noting that Mozambique has a relatively high poverty rate, especially in rural areas. But what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? I've heard it's a pretty expensive place to live.
Ah, yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis is indeed a more expensive destination, especially when it comes to housing and food. But, you know, it's a small island nation, and the cost of living is reflective of that. Plus, the beautiful beaches and crystal clear waters are worth every penny, don't you think?
Absolutely. Leo! But seriously, what about job opportunities in these two countries? I've heard that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a relatively high unemployment rate, especially for young people.
That's true. Lyra, Saint Kitts and Nevis does have a relatively high unemployment rate, especially among young people. But, you know, the tourism industry is a big employer, and there are also opportunities in the financial sector.
I see. And what about Mozambique? I've heard that the economy is growing, that there are still a lot of challenges.
Yes, that's true. Mozambique's economy is growing, but it's still a developing country with a lot of challenges, including poverty, corruption, and a lack of infrastructure.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing these two countries in terms of economic development?
That's a tough question, Mira. But I think one of the biggest challenges facing both countries is the lack of investment in education and infrastructure. In Mozambique, it's a lack of investment in education and healthcare, while in Saint Kitts and Nevis, it's a lack of investment in infrastructure, including roads and public transportation.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a lot of potential for growth and development, especially in the tourism and agriculture sectors.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth noting that both countries have a lot to offer in terms of culture and natural beauty, which could be a big draw for tourists and investors.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me that the country has a lot of potential for growth and development, especially in the tourism sector.
And I'm sure our listeners living in Saint Kitts and Nevis would agree with me that the country has a lot to offer in terms of culture and natural beauty, despite the challenges.
Speaking of challenges, Leo, what do you think is the biggest misconception about these two countries in terms of economic conditions and cost of living?
That's a good question. Nira, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that both countries are extremely cheap to live in. While it's true that Mozambique is relatively affordable, Saint Kitts and Nevis is actually quite expensive, especially when it comes to housing and food.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a lot of opportunities for expats and digital nomads, especially in the tourism and financial sectors.
Absolutely. Lira, and I think it's worth noting that both countries have a lot to offer in terms of culture and natural beauty, which could be a big draw for tourists and investors.
If you're considering moving to either of these countries, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What are your thoughts on the economic conditions and cost of living in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more in-depth discussions on these topics and more.
So, let's dive into the world of accommodation options and quality in Mozambique. I'm sure our listeners are curious to know what kind of housing they can expect in this beautiful country.
Mozambique, the land of sun-kissed beaches and vibrant culture. When it comes to accommodation, you'll find a mix of affordable options, from guest houses to luxury resorts. But let's be real. Mia, the real challenge is finding a place that's both affordable and safe.
Fair point. Yeah. But I think Mozambique has made significant strides in improving its housing infrastructure. I mean, have you seen the stunning villas along the coast? They're perfect for those who want to live the high life.
Yes, those villas are definitely a treat. But for the average expat, the reality is a bit different. You'll find that many apartments and houses are still in need of renovation, and the infrastructure can be a bit lacking.
That's true. But Mozambique is also a country with a rich history and culture. If you're willing to look beyond the surface, you'll find that there are some amazing hidden gems. Like, have you heard about the beautiful colonial-era houses in Maputo?
Yes. Those houses are indeed beautiful. But let's not forget that Mozambique is also a country with a significant shortage of housing. I mean, have you seen the prices of apartments in Maputo? It's like trying to buy a mansion in Manhattan.
Well, I suppose that's one way to put it, Leah. But seriously, Mozambique does have a lot to offer when it comes to accommodation. From beachside bungalows to safari-style lodges, there's something for every budget and style.
Yes. And let's not forget the added bonus of Mozambique's laid-back atmosphere. You'll find that many expats here are more relaxed and friendly than in other countries.
That's so true, Leo. And I think that's part of the charm of living in Mozambique. It's a country that's still a bit off the beaten path, but that's what makes it so special.
Exactly. And speaking of special, let's talk about Saint Kitts and Nevis. I mean, have you seen the prices of real estate there? It's like buying a private island.
Oh, yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis is definitely a country that's geared towards the luxury market. But I think that's part of its charm. It's a place where you can't really escape the stresses of everyday life.
Yes. And let's not forget the added bonus of St. Kitts and Nevis' stunning beaches and crystal clear waters. You'll find that many of the resorts and villas here are situated right on the beach, offering breathtaking views.
That's so true, Leo. And I think that's part of the appeal of living in St. Kitts and Nevis. It's a place where you can truly indulge in the finer things in life.
Exactly. And, speaking of indulgence, let's talk about the cost of living in St. Kitts and Nevis. I mean, have you seen the prices of food and transportation there? It's like living in a whole different world.
Oh, yes. St. Kitts and Nevis is definitely a country that's geared towards the high-end market. But I think that's part of its charm. It's a place where you can't really experience the luxury lifestyle.
Yes. And let's not forget the added bonus of St. Kitts and Nevis' unique culture and history. You'll find that many of the expats here are drawn to the island's rich heritage and vibrant art scene.
That's so true, Leo. And I think that's part of the appeal of living in St. Kitts and Nevis. It's a place where you can't really experience the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And speaking of the best of both worlds, let's talk about the pros and cons of living in both Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. I mean, have you seen the reviews of expats who have lived in both countries?
Oh, yes. I have seen some of those reviews. And let's just say that they're interesting. But I think that's part of the fun of living in these countries. You'll find that every expat has a unique experience. And that's what makes it so special.
Oh, yes. And let's not forget the added bonus of the unique perspectives that you'll get from living in both countries. You'll find that many expats here are more open-minded and adaptable than in other countries.
That's so true, Leo. And I think that's part of the charm of living in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. It's a place where you can't really experience the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And speaking of the best of both worlds, let's talk about the final verdict. I mean, Have you seen the comparison charts of accommodation options and quality in both countries?
Ah, yes. I have seen some of those charts. Let's just say that they're informative. But I think that's part of the fun of comparing these two countries. You'll find that every expat has a unique perspective. And that's what makes it so special.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget the added bonus of the unique insights that you'll get from comparing these two countries. You'll find that many expats here are more knowledgeable and experienced than in other countries.
That's so true, Leo. And I think that's part of the appeal of living in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. It's a place where you can't really experience the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And speaking of the best of both worlds, I think that's a wrap for our discussion on accommodation options and quality in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Yes. I think you're right, Leo. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the world of accommodation options and quality in these two beautiful countries.
Yes. It's been a pleasure, Mira, and I think that's a wrap for today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting conversations on expat life and travel.
Yes. And don't forget to follow us on social. Dive into the bureaucratic jungle of visa, immigration, and official procedures in our two countries. Mozambique, with its rich history and stunning coastlines, has a unique approach to expat life. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever navigated the Mozambican visa process?
Yes. I once tried to get a visa for a friend. And let me tell you, it was an adventure. The paperwork was overwhelming, but I managed to wrangle it together. I'm sure it's not that difficult for our listeners, but I do recall one particularly enthusiastic immigration officer who made me question my life choices.
Oh, I'm sure that was a real challenge. Mozambique does have a reputation for being a bit unpredictable, but in all seriousness, what are some key differences between the Mozambican and Saint Kitts and Nevis visa processes?
Well, St. Kitts and Nevis has a relatively streamlined process, especially for EU citizens. It's a bit more straightforward, but I've heard that Mozambique's process can be more complicated. I think it's essential to research the specific requirements for your nationality and the type of visa you're applying for.
That's great advice, Leo. And speaking of research, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the visa requirements for Mozambique. Can you tell us a bit more about the different types of visas available?
Yes. Mozambique offers a range of visas, including tourist, business, and work visas. Each has its own set of requirements, but I've found that the tourist visa is usually the most straightforward. However, I've also heard that the work visa process can be a bit more involved.
Indeed. And what about the official procedures for registering with the authorities in Mozambique? Are there any specific requirements or documents that our listeners need to be aware of?
Yes. In Mozambique, you'll need to register with the local authorities and obtain a residence permit. This process can be a bit more complicated, but I've found that it's worth the effort. You'll need to provide proof of address, identity, and sometimes even a police certificate.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of paperwork. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the official procedures for St. Kitts and Nevis. Can you tell us a bit more about the process of registering with the authorities and obtaining a residence permit?
Yes. In St. Kitts and Nevis, the process is relatively straightforward. You'll need to register with the local authorities and obtain a residence permit, but the requirements are generally less stringent than in Mozambique. You'll need to provide proof of address, identity, and sometimes even a police certificate.
I see. And what about the ease of communication with the authorities in both countries? Are there any language barriers or cultural differences that our listeners should be aware of?
Yes. In Mozambique, Portuguese is the official language, but many locals also speak English. However, in St. Kitts and Nevis, English is the primary language, making it easier for expats to communicate with the authorities. I've found that it's always a good idea to learn a few basic phrases in the local language to show respect and appreciation for the culture.
That's great advice. And speaking of language, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language requirements for both countries. Are there any specific languages or proficiency levels that are required for expats?
Yes. In Mozambique, you'll need to demonstrate a basic understanding of Portuguese, but in Saint Kitts and Nevis, English is the primary language. However, I've found that it's always a good idea to learn a few basic phrases in the local language to show respect and appreciation for the culture.
I see. And what about the overall ease of settling in both countries? Are there any specific challenges or benefits that our listeners should be aware of?
Yes. In both countries, the ease of settling will depend on your individual circumstances and the specific requirements for your nationality and type of visa. However, I've found that Mozambique offers a more immersive experience, with a rich culture and stunning landscapes. Saint Kitts and Nevis, on the other hand, offers a more relaxed atmosphere, with a strong focus on tourism and expat community.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of tourism, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tourist infrastructure in both countries. Are there any specific attractions or experiences that are not to be missed?
Yes. In Mozambique, you'll find a range of stunning beaches, national parks, and cultural attractions, including the famous Gorongosa National Park. In Saint Kitts and Nevis, you'll find a range of beautiful beaches, historic sites, and cultural attractions, including the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park.
Wow, that sounds like a lot to take in. And finally, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the overall experience of living in both countries. Are there any specific tips or advice that you would offer to our listeners?
Yes. I would recommend researching the specific requirements for your nationality and type of visa, as well as learning a few basic phrases in the local language to show respect and appreciation for the culture. Additionally, I would suggest being flexible and open-minded, as well as being prepared for any challenges that may arise. And, of course, always remember to have a sense of humor and to enjoy the journey.
Hey, let's get into the nitty-gritty of healthcare in our two countries, Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. I'm curious, Leo, have you heard about the health system in Mozambique? How does it compare to what we're used to in Western countries?
Mozambique's healthcare system is quite different from what we're familiar with in the West. It's a public-private mixed system, with a strong focus on primary healthcare. However, resources are limited, and the system often struggles to meet the needs of the population.
That's an understatement, right? I mean, Mozambique has a shortage of healthcare professionals, especially in rural areas. And when it comes to medical equipment, it's often outdated or in short supply. But, on the other hand, the country has made significant progress in reducing child mortality rates and improving maternal health.
That's true. Mozambique has made strides in reducing child mortality rates, and the country has also implemented various health programs to combat diseases like AIDS and tuberculosis. However, the quality of care can vary greatly depending on the region and the hospital.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me that the healthcare system has its challenges. But what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? How does its healthcare system compare to Mozambique's?
Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more developed healthcare system, with a strong focus on primary care and a well-equipped hospital. The country has a relatively low infant mortality rate and a high life expectancy compared to Mozambique.
That's not surprising, given the economic differences between the two countries. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a higher GDP per capita and a more developed infrastructure. But I'm curious, Leo, what about the quality of care in Saint Kitts and Nevis? Is it on par with what we're used to in Western countries?
Well, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a well-trained medical workforce, and the country has a good reputation for providing quality healthcare. However, like many Caribbean countries, it struggles with a shortage of healthcare professionals, particularly in specialties like psychiatry and surgery.
I see. So, it's not a perfect system, but it's better than what we see in Mozambique. But let's talk about the cultural nuances of healthcare in these two countries. In Mozambique, for example, traditional healers and spiritual leaders play a significant role in healthcare, especially in rural areas.
Yes. In Mozambique, traditional healers and spiritual leaders are often consulted alongside Western medicine. It's a fascinating blend of traditional and modern healthcare practices. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, the healthcare system is more westernized, with a focus on evidence-based medicine.
That's right. In Saint Kitts and Nevis, the healthcare system is more standardized, with a focus on Western medicine. But I'm curious, Leo, what about the role of insurance in healthcare in these two countries? Do people have access to health insurance? And if so, how does it work?
In Mozambique, access to health insurance is limited, especially for the poor. However, the country has implemented various health insurance programs, including the National Health Insurance Scheme, which provides coverage for a range of health services.
That's good to know. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, what about the role of insurance in healthcare? Is it more developed?
Yes. In St. Kitts and Nevis, the healthcare system is more developed, and health insurance is more widely available. The country has a well-established health insurance system, with a range of options for individuals and employers.
I see. It's clear that the healthcare systems in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis have their differences. But what about the patient experience? How do people in these countries access healthcare services? And what are their experiences like?
That's a great question. In both countries, patients often face challenges in accessing healthcare services, particularly in rural areas. However, in St. Kitts and Nevis, patients generally have better access to healthcare services, with a more developed infrastructure and a well-trained medical workforce.
I'm curious, Leo, what about the cost of healthcare in these two countries? Are there any significant differences in terms of cost?
Yes. In Mozambique, healthcare is generally more affordable, but the quality of care can vary greatly depending on the region and the hospital. In St. Kitts and Nevis, healthcare is more expensive, but the quality of care is generally better.
I see. So it's clear that the cost of healthcare is a significant factor in these two countries. But what about the overall quality of healthcare? How do these two countries compare in terms of health outcomes?
That's a great question. In terms of health outcomes, St. Kitts and Nevis generally has better health outcomes, with lower infant mortality rates and higher life expectancy compared to Mozambique.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that healthcare is a critical aspect of any country's development. And it's clear that both Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to healthcare. But what about our listeners' experiences? Have you had any experiences with healthcare in these countries that you'd like to share?
Yes. I've had the opportunity to visit both countries and experience their healthcare systems firsthand. And I have to say, both countries have their challenges, but they also have their strengths.
I see. Well, it's clear that we have a lot to learn from both countries, and I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate the insights we've shared today. Everyone!
Thank you. Nira, it's been a pleasure discussing healthcare in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis with you. And to our listeners, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us in the comments section.
Dive into transportation infrastructure and convenience in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. I'm to share some insights on how these countries are navigating the challenges of modern transportation.
Great topic. I've had my fair share of crazy bus rides in Mozambique. The country's road network is extensive, but the condition of the roads can be quite rough.
That's an understatement. I've heard horror stories about the potholes on Mozambique's roads. But on the bright side, the country has made significant investments in public transportation, particularly in the capital city, Capita.
Yeah, The Maputo Metro is a great example of modern public transportation. It's efficient and relatively affordable. But have you ever tried to hail a taxi in Maputo? It's like a game of roulette.
I can imagine. But in all seriousness, taxi services in Mozambique can be a bit unreliable. However, the country's public transportation system is generally well organized, with plenty of buses and minibuses connecting major towns and cities.
That's true. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, the transportation scene is quite different. The country has a well-developed road network, with a focus on improving infrastructure to accommodate tourism.
Exactly. Saint Kitts and Nevis has invested heavily in road maintenance and expansion, making it easier for tourists to get around the island. But what about public transportation? Is it as convenient as the road network?
Well, the bus system in Saint Kitts and Nevis is relatively limited, but it's improving. The country has introduced a new public transportation system, which includes a fleet of buses and a network of routes connecting popular tourist areas.
I bet our listeners in Saint Kitts and Nevis are to hear about the new public transportation system. And I have to ask, what's the most memorable transportation experience you've had in Saint Kitts and Nevis? Leo?
Well, I once took a ferry from Saint Kitts to Nevis. It was a beautiful ride, but the ferry was a bit unreliable. Let's just say I had to use my sense of humor to pass the time.
I can imagine. But ferry services in Saint Kitts and Nevis are an important part of the transportation network. And in Mozambique, what about air travel? How easy is it to get around the country by plane?
Air travel in Mozambique is a bit of a challenge. The country has a relatively small airport network, and flights can be expensive. But if you're traveling from one major city to another, flying is often the fastest option.
That's right. In Saint Kitts and Nevis, air travel is relatively easy, with a small but efficient airport serving the island. But what about the cost of transportation in both countries? Is it affordable for tourists and locals alike?
Well, the cost of transportation in both countries can vary depending on the mode of transport and the distance traveled. However, generally speaking, public transportation in Mozambique is relatively affordable, while air travel can be more expensive.
That's a great point, Leo. And I have to ask, what's the most common mode of transportation you've used in Mozambique? Was it a bus, a taxi, or something else entirely?
Well, I've used my fair share of buses and taxis in Mozambique, but if I had to choose, I'd say it's been a combination of both. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, what about the road conditions? Are they as rough as Mozambique's?
Well, Saint Kitts and Nevis has its own set of road challenges, but they're generally better maintained than Mozambique's. The country's narrow roads can be a bit nerve-wracking, especially for tourists.
I can imagine. But seriously, the road network in Saint Kitts and Nevis is improving, and the country is investing in infrastructure to accommodate tourism. And in Mozambique, what about the impact of transportation on the environment? Is there a focus on sustainable transportation options?
That's a great question, Leo. Mozambique is indeed focusing on sustainable transportation options, particularly in the capital city. The country has introduced electric buses and is investing in green transportation infrastructure.
That's fantastic to hear, Mira. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, what about the role of tourism in shaping the transportation landscape? How has tourism impacted the transportation infrastructure in the country?
Well, tourism has had a significant impact on the transportation infrastructure in Saint Kitts and Nevis. The country has invested heavily in road maintenance and expansion to accommodate the growing number of tourists.
That's true. And I have to ask, what's the most memorable transportation experience you've had in Saint Kitts and Nevis? Mira.
Well, I once took a taxi from the airport to my hotel, and the driver gave me a fantastic tour of the island. He was so knowledgeable about the history and culture of Saint Kitts and Nevis.
That sounds like a great experience. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners in St. Kitts and Nevis appreciate the local knowledge of their taxi drivers.
Dive into the world of language barriers and ease of communication in Mozambique. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever navigated a conversation in Portuguese with a Mozambican local?
Well, I've tried my best to order a plate of peri chicken in Portuguese, but let's just say I won't be winning any language awards anytime soon. However, I have to say that the locals were really patient with me, and we managed to have a great conversation despite my lack of language skills.
I'm sure that was a hilarious experience. Mozambique is a country with a rich cultural heritage, and language plays a significant role in that. Did you know that there are over 23 languages spoken in Mozambique, including Portuguese, which is the official language?
Wow, 23 languages. That's mind-boggling. I can only imagine the complexity of communication in a country with such linguistic diversity. But I'm curious. Mira, how do you think this affects expats who are trying to learn the local language?
Great question. Leo, as an expat, learning the local language can be a daunting task, but definitely worth the effort. In Mozambique, I found that many locals are eager to practice their English skills, especially in the tourism industry. So if you're an expat, don't be afraid to try your hand at Portuguese. You might just find that you pick it up faster than you think.
That's really encouraging to hear. Mira, but I'm also curious about the cultural norms of communication in Mozambique. I've heard that the concept of simpatia is really important in Mozambican culture. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Simpatia is a beautiful concept that emphasizes the importance of being friendly, approachable, and empathetic in your interactions with others. It's all about creating a sense of community and connection with the people around you. And I have to say, I found that Mozambicans are some of the friendliest people I've ever met. They're always willing to lend a helping hand or offer a warm smile.
That's terrific to hear. Mira, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that simpatia is an essential part of effective communication in Mozambique?
Great question. Leo, I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me. Simpatia is indeed a vital aspect of communication in the country. But I'm also curious. Have you ever encountered any language barriers in Mozambique that made communication difficult?
Well, I've had my fair share of miscommunications. But one time that stands out in my mind was when I tried to order a plate of papadianatas, which I thought meant pineapple cake, but it turned out to be a delicious pineapple-filled pastry instead.
Oh my goodness. That's hilarious. I can just imagine the look on your face when you realized you'd ordered the wrong dessert. But, in all seriousness, language barriers can be a significant challenge for expats in Mozambique. Have you ever had to rely on translation services or interpreters to communicate with locals?
Yes. That's definitely been the case for me on occasion. But I've also found that many Mozambicans are eager to learn English, and they're often happy to help me out with translations or provide me with language support.
That's terrific to hear, Leo. And I'm curious, what advice would you give to our listeners who are planning to move to Mozambique and are concerned about language barriers?
Well, I'd say that the key is to be open-minded, patient, and willing to learn. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. And, of course, try to learn some basic Portuguese phrases to show your respect for the local culture.
Great advice, Leo. And I'm also curious. Have you ever had to navigate a conversation in Saint Kitts and Nevis, our second country of comparison?
Yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis is a beautiful island nation with a unique cultural heritage. And, I have to say, the locals are some of the friendliest people I've ever met. They're always welcoming and eager to chat.
I'm sure our listeners would agree with you, Leo. But I'm also curious about the language situation in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Did you know that the official language is English, but many locals also speak a Creole dialect known as Nevisian?
Wow, that's fascinating. I had no idea that Creole was spoken in Saint Kitts and Nevis. But I'm also curious. Mira, how do you think the language situation in Saint Kitts and Nevis compares to Mozambique?
Ah, great question. Leo! While both countries have their unique language challenges, I think St. Kitts and Nevis has a more straightforward language situation with English being the dominant language. But I'm also curious, have you ever encountered any language barriers in St. Kitts and Nevis that made communication difficult?
Yes. I have to say that I've had some miscommunications in St. Kitts and Nevis, but mostly due to my own lack of knowledge about the local culture and customs. However, I've found that the locals are always willing to help me out and provide me with language support.
That's terrific to hear, Leo. And I'm also curious, what advice would you give to our listeners who are planning to move to St. Kitts and Nevis and are concerned about language barriers?
Well, I'd say that the key is to be open-minded, patient, and willing to learn. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and, of course, try to learn some basic phrases in Creole to show your respect for the local culture.
Oh, great advice. Leo, and I'm also curious, have you ever had to navigate a conversation in both Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis and compare the two experiences?
Yes. That's a great question, Mira. And I have to say, while both countries have their unique language challenges, I think Mozambique is a more challenging language environment for expats, mainly due to the linguistic diversity and the need to learn Portuguese.
I see what you mean. But I'm also curious, have you ever encountered any language barriers in St. Kitts and Nevis that made communication difficult?
Yes. I have to say that I've had some miscommunications in St. Kitts and Nevis, but mostly due to my own lack of knowledge about the local culture and customs. However, I've found that the locals are always willing to help me out and provide me with language support.
That's terrific to hear, Leo. And I'm also. So let's dive into the fascinating world of cultural diversity and tolerance in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. I'm curious, Leo, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of these countries?
Well, Lyra, for me, it's the rich history of Mozambique, with its African, Portuguese, and Arabic influences. It's like a vibrant tapestry, woven from different threads. And St. Kitts and Nevis, with its Caribbean flair, is like a sweet melody, blending African, European, and indigenous rhythms.
I love that analogy, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries have a strong sense of community, despite their diverse backgrounds. In Mozambique, I heard that the local phrase Mozambicanidade captures the essence of this cultural diversity.
That's right, Mira. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, the phrase one people, one nation reflects the country's commitment to unity and social cohesion. But I'm curious, what do you think makes Mozambique's cultural diversity so unique?
That's a great question, Leo. I think it's the way Mozambicans have managed to blend their African heritage with European and Asian influences. It's like a delicious stew, where each ingredient adds its own flavor. And, of course, the country's history of colonialism and independence has also played a significant role in shaping its cultural identity.
Yes. The colonial legacy is definitely a factor. But in St. Kitts and Nevis, I think the country's small size and geography have contributed to its unique cultural landscape. The island's history of sugar plantations and slavery has also left a lasting impact on its cultural heritage.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think it's interesting that both countries have a strong tradition of music and dance. In Mozambique, the traditional dance of Mara Bente is a great example of this cultural expression.
Oh, yes. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, the calypso music is a staple of the island's cultural scene. But I'm curious, Mira, how do you think the two countries compare when it comes to social tolerance and acceptance?
That's a great question. Leah, I think both countries have made significant progress in promoting social tolerance and acceptance. In Mozambique, I've noticed that there's still a strong emphasis on traditional values and customs, particularly in rural areas.
Oh, yes. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis. I think the country's small size and tight-knit community have contributed to a more accepting and inclusive society. But I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners can learn from the cultural diversity and tolerance in these two countries?
I think our listeners can learn a lot from the way Mozambicans in Kittish and Ness have managed to balance their cultural diversity with social harmony. It's a great reminder that, despite our differences, we can still come together and celebrate our unique cultural identities.
Beautifully said. Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives and programs that promote social cohesion and cultural exchange.
Exactly. And I think it's great that these initiatives are often driven by local community leaders and organizations, rather than government programs. It's a testament to the power of grassroots movements in promoting social change.
Yes. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners can do to promote cultural diversity and tolerance in their own communities?
Well, Leo, I think one thing we can do is to learn more about the cultural heritage and traditions of our neighbors and friends. By doing so, we can build bridges of understanding and respect, and create a more inclusive and welcoming community.
Beautifully said, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, there are many opportunities for cultural exchange and education, particularly through music and dance.
Yes. And I think our listeners can also learn from the way these countries have incorporated their cultural heritage into their national identity. It's a great reminder that our cultural diversity is a strength, not a weakness.
Yes. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners can expect from our next topic, which will be on the topic of education in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Leo, I think our listeners can expect a lively and informative discussion about the education systems in both countries. We'll be exploring the challenges and opportunities facing these systems, and hearing from experts and individuals who have experience with education in these countries.
Great. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners can do to get involved in promoting education and cultural exchange in these countries?
Well, Leo, I think one thing we can do is to support organizations and initiatives that promote education and cultural exchange. We can also share our own experiences and perspectives on social media, and use our voices to raise awareness about the importance of cultural diversity and tolerance.
Beautifully said, Mira. And I'm curious. What do you think our listeners can learn from the education systems in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
I think our listeners can learn a lot from the way these countries have managed to balance traditional values and customs with modern education systems. It's a great reminder that education is key to promoting social cohesion and cultural understanding.
Yes. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners can do to promote cultural diversity and tolerance in their own communities, particularly through education?
Well, Leo, I think one thing we can do is to incorporate diverse perspectives and experiences into our education systems. We can also create opportunities for cultural exchange and education, particularly through music and dance.
Beautifully said. Mira, and I'm curious. What do you think our listeners can expect from our next topic, which will be on the topic of economic development in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Leo, I think our listeners can expect a detailed and informative discussion about the economic systems in both countries. We'll be exploring the challenges and opportunities facing these systems, and hearing from experts and individuals who have experience with economic development in these countries.
Great. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners can do to get involved in promoting economic development and cultural exchange in these countries?
Well, Leo, I think one thing we can do is to support organizations and initiatives that promote economic development and cultural exchange. We can also share our own experiences and perspectives on social media, and use our voices to raise awareness about the importance of cultural diversity and tolerance.
Ah, beautifully said. Mira! And I'm curious, what do you think our listeners can?
So, let's talk about educational opportunities in Mozambique. I'm sure our listeners living in this country would agree with me that literacy rates are a big concern. But I've heard that the government is making efforts to improve education, especially in rural areas.
Ah, yes. And that's where innovative teaching methods come in. I've read about some amazing programs that use interactive learning and community involvement to get kids about education. It's like they say, when you make learning fun, you'll never stop learning.
That's so true. And I've seen some amazing videos of teachers using music and dance to teach math and science. It's like a party in the classroom.
I know, right? And it's not just about the kids either. Adult education programs are also on the rise in Mozambique, which is great for people who want to continue their education later in life.
Exactly. And speaking of adult education, I've heard that Saint Kitts and Nevis has some amazing programs for English language learners. I'm actually curious about what others think about the language schools in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Have any of you had experience with language schools there?
Well, I've done some research, and it seems that St. Kitts and Nevis has a pretty strong reputation for language schools. They offer a range of programs, from beginner to advanced levels, and even have some specialized courses for business, English, and tourism.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I've heard that the teachers in St. Kitts and Nevis are highly qualified and experienced. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the language schools in St. Kitts and Nevis. Maybe we can even get some testimonials from people who have used the services?
That's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of testimonials, I've heard that Mozambique has some amazing success stories in terms of educational achievements. For example, did you know that Mozambique has one of the highest rates of female literacy in Africa?
Yes, that's true. And I think it's because of the government's efforts to provide education for girls, especially in rural areas. It's amazing to see how education can empower women and girls to take control of their lives.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the girls either. Education is key to breaking the cycle of poverty in Mozambique. And I think the government is doing a great job in terms of providing access to education for all.
I completely agree. Leah, and speaking of breaking cycles, I think it's interesting to note that both Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis have a strong emphasis on education as a way to improve socio-economic conditions. Maybe we can talk more about how education is seen as a tool for development in both countries?
Ah, yes. That's a great point. Leah, and I think it's worth noting that education is not just about personal development, but also about contributing to the growth and development of the country as a whole. It's like they say, when you educate one person, you educate the entire community.
I love that. And I think that's a great way to wrap up this topic. Thanks, Leo, for sharing your insights on educational opportunities in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on educational opportunities in language schools around the world.
And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
I'm to dive into the climate and seasonal conditions of Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis. Our listeners might be wondering, what's the temperature like in these tropical countries? I'm curious to know how the locals adapt to the changing seasons.
Ah, great point. Mira, both countries have a tropical climate, but Mozambique's temperature is generally warmer, especially in the north. St. Kitts and Nevis, on the other hand, have a more moderate climate, with temperatures ranging from 22 degrees Celsius to 28 degrees Celsius. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree that it's essential to stay hydrated during the hot summer months.
Exactly. And speaking of hydration, I'm reminded of a funny incident when I visited Mozambique. My friend and I were trying to buy a cold drink from a street vendor, but he kept telling us it was too hot for cold drinks. We were like, but it's 40 degrees Celsius outside. He just smiled and said, you're not from around here, are you?
That's hilarious. Mira! I'm sure our listeners can relate to that kind of humor. But, seriously, Saint Kitts and Nevis have a unique climate feature, the trade winds. They bring a gentle breeze that makes the temperature feel more comfortable. I'm curious to know. Mira, have you experienced the trade winds in Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Actually, Leo, I haven't visited Saint Kitts and Nevis yet, but I've heard great things about the trade winds. I'm sure it's a welcome relief from the heat. Mozambique, on the other hand, has a more pronounced wet and dry season. The rainy season can be quite intense, with heavy downpours and flooding. I'm sure our listeners living in Mozambique have some exciting stories to share about navigating the rainy season.
That's right, Mira. And speaking of stories, I've heard that the locals in Mozambique have a great sense of humor about the rainy season. They say that the rain is like a refreshing shower after a hot summer day. I'm sure our listeners can relate to that kind of humor.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners in Mozambique would agree that the rain can be quite intense. But it's not all about the rain. Leo, what about the dry season? How do the locals adapt to the heat and drought?
Great question. Mira, the dry season in Mozambique can be quite challenging, especially for farmers who rely on rainfall for their crops. But the locals have developed some clever ways to adapt to the drought. For example, they use traditional irrigation systems that collect and store rainwater during the wet season. It's amazing to see how resourceful they are.
That's so cool. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these traditional irrigation systems. And speaking of resourcefulness, I'm reminded of a funny incident when I visited a village in Mozambique. The villagers were using a traditional method to collect rainwater, but it was getting cold. One of the villagers, a young girl, came up with a creative solution using an old plastic bottle. It was hilarious.
That's amazing. Mira, I'm sure our listeners can relate to that kind of creative problem solving. And speaking of creative solutions, I've heard that the locals in Saint Kitts and Nevis have developed some innovative ways to conserve water. For example, they use rainwater harvesting systems that collect and store rainwater for unpotable uses like flushing toilets.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these innovative water conservation systems. But before we move on, I want to ask our listeners a question. Have you experienced any extreme weather events in either Mozambique or Saint Kitts and Nevis? Share your stories with us in the comments.
That's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of extreme weather events, I've heard that Mozambique is prone to cyclones, which can be quite destructive. But the locals have developed some effective ways to prepare for and respond to these events. For example, they use early warning systems that alert them to the approaching cyclones.
That's so important. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these early warning systems. And speaking of preparation, I'm reminded of a funny incident when I visited a village in Mozambique. The villagers were preparing for a cyclone, but they were also having a party to celebrate the impending storm. It was hilarious.
That's amazing. Mira, I'm sure our listeners can relate to that kind of humor. And speaking of humor, I've heard that the locals in Saint Kitts and Nevis have a great sense of humor about the weather. They say that the rain is like a refreshing shower after a hot summer day. I'm sure our listeners can relate to that kind of humor.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners in Saint Kitts and Nevis would agree that the trade winds bring a welcome relief from the heat. But before we wrap up this topic, I want to ask our listeners one more question. What do you think are the most significant climate-related challenges facing these countries? Share your thoughts with us in the comments.
That's a great question. Mira, and speaking of challenges, I've heard that Mozambique is facing some significant climate-related challenges, including droughts and floods. But the locals are working hard to develop sustainable solutions to these challenges. For example, they're using innovative irrigation systems and crop insurance to mitigate the impact of droughts and floods.
That's so important. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these sustainable solutions. And speaking of solutions, I'm reminded of a funny incident when I visited a village in Mozambique. The villagers were using a traditional method to collect rainwater. But it was getting clogged. One of the villagers, a young girl, came up with a creative solution using an old plastic bottle. It was hilarious.
That's amazing. Mira, I'm sure our listeners can relate to that kind of creative problem solving. And speaking of creative solutions, I'm curious to know, Mira, what do you think are the most significant climate-related challenges facing these countries?
Oh, great question. Leah! I think one of the biggest challenges is adapting to the changing climate. Both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis are vulnerable to climate change, and it's essential for the locals to develop sustainable solutions to mitigate its impact.
That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of adaptation, I've heard that the locals in Mozambique are using traditional knowledge to adapt to the changing climate. For example, they're using traditional agriculture practices that are more resilient to droughts and floods.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried a traditional Mozambican meal? Something like matapau or peri-peri chicken?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it's a flavor explosion in your mouth. But I have to say, the portion sizes are quite generous, even for a hungry guy like me.
Generous. Indeed. Mozambican cuisine is all about hearty meals that will keep you going all day. And speaking of heartiness, let's talk about a staple food in Mozambique, maize meal, also known as nufu.
Oh, mufu. I've had that before, and it's like a warm hug in a bowl. But I'm curious. Mira, what's the deal with the different types of maize meal? Is it like a hierarchy of comfort food?
Well, Leo, it's not exactly a hierarchy, but rather a spectrum of textures and flavors. From the coarse, stone ground mufu to the fine, white mufu. Each type has its own unique characteristics. And, of course, the cooking methods vary depending on the region and the occasion.
That's fascinating. I had no idea there were so many variations. And speaking of variations, I've heard that Mozambican cuisine has been influenced by various cultures, including African, Portuguese, and even Indian.
Exactly. The cultural melting pot of Mozambique has resulted in a unique fusion of flavors and cooking techniques. And it's not just the cuisine itself, but also the way people eat together. Mealtimes in Mozambique are often lively affairs, with music, dance, and storytelling.
I can imagine. I've heard that Saint Kitts and Nevis, our other country of interest, also has a rich culinary heritage. But I'm curious, Mira, how does the food culture in Saint Kitts and Nevis compare to Mozambique?
Well, Leah, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more Caribbean-influenced cuisine, with a focus on fresh seafood, spices, and tropical fruits. And, of course, the rum punch is a staple in both countries.
Ah, yes, the rum punch. But, seriously, Mira, I've heard that St. Kitts and Nevis has a strong emphasis on local produce and sustainable farming practices. Is that true?
Absolutely. St. Kitts and Nevis is committed to reducing its carbon footprint and promoting eco-friendly agriculture. And it shows in the quality of the food, with a focus on fresh, locally sourced ingredients.
That's impressive. And I'm curious. Mira, how do the food cultures in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis reflect the values and traditions of each country?
That's a great question. Leo, in Mozambique, food is often seen as a symbol of community and hospitality. Mealtimes are opportunities to come together, share stories, and strengthen social bonds. In St. Kitts and Nevis, on the other hand, food is often tied to the island's history and cultural heritage, with a focus on preserving traditional recipes and ingredients.
I see what you mean. And speaking of preservation, I've heard that both countries are working to promote their local food cultures and preserve traditional recipes for future generations.
Exactly. In Mozambique, there are efforts to document and preserve traditional cooking techniques and recipes, particularly among older generations. In Saint Kitts and Nevis, there's a strong focus on promoting local cuisine and supporting small-scale farmers and producers.
That's great to hear. And, Mira, I'm curious. What are some of the unique nutritional benefits of the food cultures in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo! In Mozambique, the traditional diet is rich in fiber, vitamins, and minerals, thanks to the abundance of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. In Saint Kitts and Nevis, the emphasis on fresh seafood and tropical fruits provides a boost of omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants.
Wow, that's impressive. And, Mira, I'm curious, how can our listeners, especially those living in these countries, make the most of these nutritional benefits and incorporate them into their daily lives?
That's a great question. Leo, I'd say that the key is to focus on whole, locally sourced ingredients and traditional cooking methods. And, of course, don't be afraid to experiment and try new recipes.
I think our listeners will appreciate that advice. And, Mira, I'm curious, what's the deal with the street food in Mozambique? I've heard it's a whole different level of delicious.
Yes. The street food in Mozambique is indeed a culinary experience. From the grilled meats to the spicy stews, each dish is a flavor explosion. And, of course, the atmosphere is always lively, with music and laughter filling the air.
I can imagine. And, Mira, I'm curious, how does the street food in St. Kitts and Nevis compare to Mozambique?
Well, Leo, St. Kitts and Nevis has its own unique take on street food, with a focus on fresh seafood and tropical fruits. And, of course, the rum punch is always flowing.
Yes, the rum punch. But, seriously, Mira, I think our listeners would love to hear more about the street food in both countries. Can we do a follow-up episode on that topic?
I think that's a great idea. Leo? And, of course, our listeners can always share their own experiences and recommendations in the comments section.
Yes, the comments section. We love hearing from our listeners. And, Mira, I'm curious, what's the final verdict on the food cultures in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis?
I think it's clear that both countries have a rich and diverse culinary heritage, with a focus on local ingredients, traditional recipes, and community-based eating. And, of course, the rum punch is always a winner.
Yes, the rum punch. But seriously, Mira, I think our listeners will appreciate the effort we put into highlighting the unique food cultures in each country.
I think we've done a great job. Leo. And, of course, our listeners can always look forward to more delicious discussions in future episodes. Hey, did you know that Mozambique has an incredible history of colonialism and resistance? I mean, it's a country that's been shaped by the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, among others. It's like a melting pot of cultures.
Yes. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Mozambique's cultural heritage is a testament to its complex past. I'm particularly fond of the traditional dance, the Tichape, which is a form of resistance against colonialism. It's like a fusion of African and European rhythms.
Exactly. And speaking of fusion, have you tried the Mozambican cuisine? It's a delicious blend of African, Portuguese, and Asian flavors. I mean, who wouldn't love a good plate of peri-peri chicken or arroz de pescado?
Oh, Mira, you're making me hungry. But seriously, the food in Mozambique is incredible. And it's not just about the taste. It's also about the cultural significance. For example, the traditional dish, Marapa, is a symbol of community and share.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the cultural heritage of Mozambique is accurately represented in popular media?
Oh, that's a great question. Mira, and I think it's essential to acknowledge the impact of colonialism on the country's cultural identity. Genoff, I loves uncovering stories like this. And so do we. But it's not just about the past. It's also about the present and how Mozambicans are working to preserve their cultural heritage.
Exactly. And speaking of preservation, have you heard about the Mozambique music adibale? It's a traditional style of music that's been influenced by African, Portuguese, and Brazilian rhythm. It's like a cultural fusion explosion.
Oh, Mira, you're on fire today. But seriously, the music at D-Bale is an incredible example of Mozambique's cultural diversity. And it's not just about the music. It's also about the dance and the storytelling that goes along with it.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the music at D-Bale and its cultural significance. Maybe we can even have a guest on the show who's an expert on Mozambique and music and culture.
Oh, that's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of cultural experts, I've been reading about the Saint Kitts and Nevis National Archives, which houses an incredible collection of historical documents and artifacts. It's like a treasure trove of information about the country's past.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the National Archives and its significance. Do you think the cultural heritage of Saint Kitts and Nevis is well represented in popular media?
Ah, that's a great question, Mira. And I think it's essential to acknowledge the impact of colonialism on the country's cultural identity. But it's also important to recognize the unique cultural traditions of Saint Kitts and Nevis, such as the Sugarmas Festival, which celebrates the country's sugar industry.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the Sugarmas Festival and its cultural significance. Maybe we can even have a guest on the show who's an expert on Saint Kitts and Nevis cultural heritage.
Ah, that's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of cultural experts, I've been reading about the African diaspora in Saint Kitts and Nevis, which has had a significant impact on the country's cultural identity. It's like a story of resilience and adaptation.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the African diaspora in Saint Kitts and Nevis and its cultural significance. Maybe we can even have a guest on the show who's an expert on this topic.
Ah, that's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of cultural significance, I think it's essential to recognize the importance of preserving cultural heritage in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. It's like a responsibility to our shared human history.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me. It's not just about preserving cultural heritage. It's also about promoting cross-cultural understanding and appreciation. And that's where Jet Off AI comes in. They're all about promoting cultural exchange and understanding.
Ah, that's so true. And I think it's essential to acknowledge the role of technology in preserving cultural heritage. For example, Jetoff AI is working with museums and cultural institutions to create digital archives of cultural artifacts and documents.
That's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about this initiative and its impact on cultural preservation. Maybe we can even have a guest on the show who's working on this project.
Ah, that's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of cultural preservation, I think it's essential to recognize the importance of community engagement in preserving cultural heritage. It's like a collective effort to preserve our shared human history.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me. It's not just about preserving cultural heritage. It's also about promoting community engagement and participation. And that's where the cultural values of Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis come, and they're all about community and sharing.
Ah, that's so true. And I think it's essential to acknowledge the unique cultural values of each country. For example, Mozambique's cultural values are centered around community and sharing, while Saint Kitts and Nevis' cultural values are centered around resilience and adaptation.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the cultural values of each country and how they're reflected in their daily lives. Maybe we can even have a guest on the show who's an expert on cultural values and their significance.
Ah, that's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of cultural significance, I think it's essential to recognize the importance of cultural exchange and understanding in promoting cross-cultural appreciation. It's like a global effort to preserve our shared human history.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me. It's not just about preserving cultural heritage. It's also about promoting cross-cultural understanding and appreciation. And that's where Jet Off AI comes in there, all about promoting cultural exchange and understanding.
Ah, that's so true. And I think it's essential to acknowledge the role of technology in promoting cultural exchange and understanding. For example, Jidoff AI is working with cultural institutions to create digital platforms for cultural exchange and collaboration.
That's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about this initiative. When it comes to natural beauties and landscapes, I'm always to explore new countries and discover their unique treasures. Today, we're diving into the stunning world of Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. Let's start with Mozambique, a country known for its incredible coastline and vibrant coral reefs. Can you imagine swimming with dolphins and sea turtles in the crystal clear waters of the Indian Ocean?
Yes. Mozambique's coastline is indeed breathtaking. But, Nira, have you ever been to the beautiful islands of Basaruto and Bingara? They're a paradise for snorkelers and scuba divers, with an incredible array of marine life. And, of course, who can forget the stunning natural beauty of the Gorongosa National Park, with its lush forests, waterfalls, and diverse wildlife?
That sounds amazing. Leo, I'd love to visit Gorongosa one day. And speaking of diverse wildlife, did you know that Mozambique is home to over 1,000 species of birds? I'm sure our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me that the country's natural beauty is truly a treasure trove.
Yes, Mira, you're absolutely right. And Saint Kitts and Nevis, our other country of interest, is not to be left behind. Have you heard about the beautiful beaches of Frigate Bay and Cockleshell Bay? They're perfect for sunbathing and swimming, with crystal clear waters and powdery white sand.
I've heard about those beaches, Leo. But what I'm really curious about is the unique natural beauty of Saint Kitts and Nevis. Did you know that the country is home to the highest peak in the Leeward Islands, Mount Misery? It's a challenging hike, but the views from the top are simply breathtaking.
Ah, yes. Mira, you're always up for a challenge, aren't you? But, seriously, Mount Misery is an incredible natural wonder. And have you ever heard about the beautiful Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park? A UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a must-visit attraction for anyone interested in history and natural beauty.
Oh, yes. I've heard about Brimstone Hill. Leo, it's a fascinating piece of history, and the views from the top are simply stunning. And speaking of stunning views, I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the beautiful sunsets in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Have you ever seen a sunset on the beach? Leo?
Ah, yes. Nira, I have. And it's truly a sight to behold. The sky turns pink and orange, and the sun dips below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ocean. It's a moment of pure magic. And, of course, no trip to St. Kitts and Nevis would be complete without trying some of the local cuisine. Have you tried the delicious seafood, Mira?
Oh, yes. Leo, I have. And it's simply delicious. But what I'm really curious about is the unique cultural heritage of St. Kitts and Nevis. Did you know that the country has a rich history of African and European influences, reflected in its music, art, and cuisine?
Ah, yes. Mira, you're absolutely right. And St. Kitts and Nevis is also home to a number of festivals and celebrations throughout the year, showcasing the country's vibrant culture. Have you ever attended a festival, Mira?
Oh, yes. Leo, I've attended a number of festivals, and they're always a highlight of my travels. And speaking of highlights, I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the beautiful natural scenery of Mozambique. Have you ever seen the stunning beauty of the Maputo Elephant Reserve? Leo?
Ah, yes. Mira, I have. And it's truly a breathtaking sight. The reserve is home to over 1,000 elephants, as well as other wildlife such as lions, leopards, and hyenas. It's a must-visit attraction for anyone interested in wildlife and natural beauty.
Oh, yes. I'd love to visit the Makhuwa Elephant Reserve one day. And speaking of wildlife, did you know that Mozambique is also home to a number of national parks and game reserves, protecting its incredible biodiversity? I'm sure our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me that the country's natural beauty is truly a treasure.
Yes. Mira, you're absolutely right. And Saint Kitts and Nevis is also working hard to protect its natural beauty, with a number of conservation efforts in place to preserve the country's unique ecosystem. Have you ever heard about the beautiful Nevis Peak? Mira.
Oh, yes. Leo, I have. And it's a stunning natural wonder. The peak offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape, and the hike to the top is a challenging but rewarding experience. And speaking of challenging experiences, I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the unique adventure opportunities in Mozambique. Have you ever gone on a safari? Leo?
Yes. Mira, I have. And it's an incredible experience. The opportunity to see wildlife in its natural habitat is truly a thrill. And, of course, no trip to Mozambique would be complete without trying some of the local cuisine. Have you tried the delicious matapa, Mira?
Oh, yes. Leo, I have. And it's simply delicious. But what I'm really curious about is the unique cultural heritage of Mozambique. Did you know that the country has a rich history of African, Portuguese, and Arab influences, reflected in its music, art, and cuisine?
Yes. Mira, you're absolutely right. And Mozambique is also home to a number of festivals and celebrations throughout the year, showcasing the country's vibrant culture. Have you ever attended a festival, Mira?
Oh, yes. Leo, I've attended a number of festivals, and they're always a highlight of my travels. And speaking of highlights, I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the beautiful natural scenery at Saint Kitts and Nevis. Have you ever seen the stunning beauty of the Sandy Point National Park? Leo?
Yes. Mira, I have. And it's truly a breathtaking sight. The park is home to a number of unique species, including the critically endangered sea turtle. It's a must-visit attraction for anyone interested in wildlife and natural beauty.
Oh, yes. I'd love to visit Sandy Point National Park one day. And speaking of wildlife, did you know that Saint Kitts and Nevis is also home to a number of national parks and game reserves? So let's dive into the exciting world of sports, activities, and adventure options in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. Both countries offer a unique blend of outdoor pursuits and cultural experiences that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me.
Absolutely. Mira, both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis have a lot to offer when it comes to adventure and sports. But let's start with Mozambique. What's your take on their national sports?
Great question. Leo, Mozambique's national sports are mostly centered around football, or soccer as we call it in the States. But did you know that they also have a strong tradition of martial arts, particularly capoeira?
Well, capoeira is amazing. I've seen some incredible performances, and I've heard that St. Kitts and Nevis has a strong focus on cricket. What do you think about that?
Cricket is a fantastic sport, Leo, but I think it's interesting that both countries have a strong emphasis on team sports. It's a great way to build community and promote social bonding. Speaking of which, have you ever been to a cricket match in St. Kitts and Nevis?
Actually, I have. It was an incredible experience. The energy of the crowd was electric. And I have to say, the food was amazing too. Have you tried any of the local cuisine in St. Kitts and Nevis? Mira?
Oh, yes. I love trying new foods. And St. Kitts and Nevis has some delicious options. But let's get back to sports. What do you think about the surfing scene in Mozambique? I've heard it's becoming increasingly popular.
Surfing is huge in Mozambique. The coastline offers some of the most beautiful waves in the world. And I've heard that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a great surfing community as well. Maybe we can compare the two countries' surfing scenes in more detail?
That's a great idea. Leo, I'd love to explore that further. And speaking of exploring, have you ever gone on a hike in Mozambique? I've heard the scenery is breathtaking.
Actually, I have. The scenery is stunning, and the hiking trails are well marked. But I have to say, the best part of hiking in Mozambique is the opportunity to see some of the incredible wildlife, like elephants and lions.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'd love to see some of that wildlife up close. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the hiking trails in Mozambique. Maybe we can plan a future episode on that topic.
Sounds like a plan. Mira, and I think it's time for us to wrap up this segment on sports, activities, and adventure options in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. But before we go, I want to ask our listeners, what are your favorite sports and activities to do in these countries?
Great question. Leo, we'd love to hear from our listeners and get some feedback on their experiences. And don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe to our core podcast for more exciting content on travel and adventure.
That's all for now. Folks, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
So, when it comes to nightlife in Mozambique, I have to say, the scene is pretty laid back. You'll find plenty of beach bars and clubs along the coast, especially in Maputo and in Hamban. It's all about soaking up the sun during the day and then dancing the night away under the stars.
That sounds like a dream come true. Mira, I've always wanted to experience that kind of relaxed vibe. But I have to ask, what about the music scene in Mozambique? Is it more about traditional genres, or do you find a lot of influences?
Great question. Leo, Mozambique has a rich musical heritage, and you'll find a mix of traditional styles like marabente and fanona, as well as modern genres like keys, R&B, and Afrobeat. It's a great way to experience the country's cultural diversity through music.
I'm intrigued by the idea of marabente music. I've heard it's a fusion of traditional Mozambican rhythms with African and Portuguese influences. Can you tell us more about it, Mira?
Absolutely. Leo, marabente is a unique blend of traditional Mozambican music with African and Portuguese styles. You'll hear a lot of percussion and guitar riffs, and it's often accompanied by energetic dance moves. It's a great way to experience the country's vibrant cultural scene.
I can imagine it's a real party. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the nightlife in Saint Kitts and Nevis. What can you tell us about the island's entertainment scene, Mira?
Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more developed nightlife scene compared to Mozambique. You'll find a variety of bars, clubs, and restaurants in Basseterre, the capital city, as well as in other towns like Frigate Bay and Cockleshell Bay.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's music scene. Is it more geared towards traditional genres, or do you find a lot of modern influences?
Great question. Leah, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a rich musical heritage, and you'll find a mix of traditional genres like calypso and quadrille, as well as modern genres like reggae and soca. It's a great way to experience the island's cultural diversity through music.
I'm curious about the island's festivals and events. What can you tell us about the annual festivals in Saint Kitts and Nevis, Mira?
Well, Leo, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a lively festival scene, and one of the most popular events is the Saint Kitts Music Festival, which takes place every June. You'll find a variety of music genres, from traditional to modern, as well as dance performances and cultural exhibitions.
That sounds like an amazing event. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's nightlife in terms of bars and clubs. What can you tell us about the popular spots in Basseterre, Mira?
Great question. Leo, Basseterre has a lively nightlife scene, and you'll find a variety of bars and clubs along the waterfront, especially in the Frigate Bay area. Some popular spots include the Basseterre Beach Bar and the Frigate Bay Beach Bar, which offers stunning views of the ocean and a lively atmosphere.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's cultural events and performances. What can you tell us about the island's theater scene? Nira?
Well, Leo, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a thriving theatre scene, and you'll find a variety of productions, from traditional to modern, at the National Museum of Saint Kitts and Nevis in the Old Road Playhouse.
That sounds like a great way to experience the island's cultural heritage. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's festivals and events. What can you tell us about the island's carnival celebrations? Mira?
Great question. Leo, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a vibrant carnival scene, and you'll find a variety of colorful costumes, music, and dance performances throughout the island during the carnival celebrations.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's nightlife in terms of live music performances. What can you tell us about the popular music venues in Basseterre? Mira?
Well, Leo, Basseterre has a lively music scene, and you'll find a variety of live music performances at venues like the Basseterre Beach Bar and the Frigate Bay Beach Bar. Some popular genres include reggae, soca, and calypso.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's cultural events and performances. What can you tell us about the island's cultural festivals? Mira?
Great question. Leo, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a vibrant cultural festival scene, and you'll find a variety of events throughout the year, including the Saint Kitts Music Festival, the Nevis Cultural Festival, and the Saint Kitts and Nevis Heritage Festival.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's nightlife in terms of bars and clubs. What can you tell us about the popular spots in Frigate Bay? Mira?
Well, Leo, Frigate Bay has a lively nightlife scene, and you'll find a variety of bars and clubs along the waterfront, especially in the Frigate Bay Beach Bar area. Some popular spots include the Frigate Bay Beach Bar and the Cockleshell Bay Beach Bar.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's cultural events and performances. What can you tell us about the island's theater productions? Mira?
Great question. Leo, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a thriving theatre scene, and you'll find a variety of productions, from traditional to modern, at the National Museum of Saint Kitts and Nevis in the Old Road Playhouse.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's festivals and events. What can you tell us about the island's Christmas celebrations? Mira?
Well, Leo, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a festive atmosphere during the Christmas season, and you'll find a variety of events and performances throughout the island, including the Saint Kitts and Nevis Christmas Festival.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's nightlife in terms of live music performances. What can you tell us about the popular music venues in Cockleshell Bay? Mira?
Great question. Leo, Cockleshell Bay has a lively music scene, and you'll find a variety of live music performances at venues like the Cockleshell Bay Beach Bar and the Frigate Bay Beach Bar.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the island's cultural events and performances. What can you tell us about the island?
Let's talk about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Mozambique. I'm sure many of you have been to the beautiful beaches of Mozambique and thought, well, this is a great place for a family vacation. But what about the local culture? How do Mozambicans treat their children and families?
Great point. Mira, Mozambique has a rich cultural heritage, and family is at the heart of it. In fact, the concept of familia is deeply rooted in Mozambican society. Children are often seen as a blessing and are showered with love and attention.
That's so sweet. And I'm sure many of our listeners have experienced this firsthand. But what about the physical environment? Are there any parks or playgrounds in Mozambique that are perfect for families with kids?
Absolutely. Mozambique has some amazing national parks and wildlife reserves that are perfect for family outings. For example, the Gorongosa National Park is a great place for a safari adventure with kids. And the beaches of Mozambique, like Tuefo and Ponta do Aro, are perfect for a relaxing family vacation.
Wow, that sounds like a dream come true. And what about the city of Makhuwa? Is it a family-friendly city?
Maputo is a great city for families. It has a lot of green spaces, like the Praia da Costa do Sol, which is a beautiful beach with clear waters. And the city also has a lot of cultural attractions, like the Fortaleza de Maputo, which is a great place to learn about Mozambican history.
That's so cool. And I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the language barrier in Mozambique. How do local kids learn English and other languages?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, in Mozambique, English is widely spoken, especially in the tourism industry. Many Mozambican kids learn English in school, and it's also a popular subject in universities. And with the rise of technology, kids are also learning languages like Portuguese and French through online resources.
That's so great to hear. And what about the education system in Mozambique? Is it a good place for kids to learn and grow?
The education system in Mozambique is improving, but it still has its challenges. However, there are many great schools and educational institutions in Mozambique that offer quality education to kids. And the government is also investing in education, especially in rural areas.
I'm so glad to hear that. And let's move on to our second country, Saint Kitts and Nevis. What's the family-friendly scene like in this beautiful Caribbean island nation?
Saint Kitts and Nevis is a paradise for families. The island is filled with beautiful beaches, parks, and playgrounds that are perfect for kids. And the people are so friendly and welcoming. It's like one big family.
That's so true. And I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the cost of living in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Is it expensive to raise a family there?
That's a great question. Mira, the cost of living in Saint Kitts and Nevis is relatively high, but it's worth it for the quality of life and the family-friendly environment. However, it's not impossible to afford, especially if you're planning to move there for a while.
That's so great to hear. And what about the language barrier in Saint Kitts and Nevis? How do local kids learn English and other languages?
That's a great question. Mira, in Saint Kitts and Nevis, English is the official language, and most people speak it fluently. However, some kids may also learn other languages like French or Spanish through school or online resources.
That's so great to hear. And let's talk about the education system in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Is it a good place for kids to learn and grow?
The education system in Saint Kitts and Nevis is excellent. The island has a high literacy rate, and the education system is well funded and well managed. And the teachers are highly qualified and dedicated to their students.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the family-friendly activities in Saint Kitts and Nevis. What are some fun things to do with kids on the island?
There are so many fun things to do with kids in Saint Kitts and Nevis. You can take them to the beautiful beaches, go snorkeling or scuba diving, or visit the Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park, which is a great place to learn about history and culture.
That sounds like a dream come true. And what about the local culture? How do Kittitians and Nevisians treat their children and families?
The local culture is so warm and welcoming. Families are at the heart of Kittitian and Nevisian society, and children are showered with love and attention. And the island has a strong sense of community, where everyone looks out for each other.
That's so true. And I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the cost of living in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Is it worth the expense?
That's a great question. Mira, while the cost of living in Saint Kitts and Nevis is relatively high, it's worth it for the quality of life and the family-friendly environment. And the island has a lot to offer, from beautiful beaches to cultural attractions.
Well, that's so great to hear. And let's summarize our findings for both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. What are some of the key takeaways from our conversation?
That's a great question. Mira, from our conversation, we can see that both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis are great places for families. They have a rich cultural heritage, beautiful natural environments, and a strong sense of community. And while there are some challenges, especially with the cost of living in Saint Kitts and Nevis, both countries offer a lot of opportunities for families to grow and thrive.
That's so true. And I'm sure many of our listeners will appreciate our findings. Thank you. Leo, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today.
Thank you, Mira, for hosting this great conversation. It's been a pleasure to share my knowledge with our listeners.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a comment or rating. We love hearing from you.
And don't forget to follow us on social media. We post updates and behind-the-scenes content regularly.
And finally, if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always here to help.
Thanks again, Mira, for this great conversation.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me when I say that the country's progress in LGBT rights is truly remarkable. From the first Pride March in Maputo in 2018 to the current efforts to amend the law to remove the ban on same-sex relationships, Mozambique has shown a remarkable commitment to inclusivity.
That's absolutely true, Mira. But let's not forget that Mozambique still has a long way to go. The law is still not fully inclusive, and there are many challenges to overcome. However, I'm heartened to see that there are many organizations and individuals working tirelessly to promote LGBT rights and visibility.
And speaking of visibility, have you heard about the LGBT Pride Parade that took place in Maputo last year? It was a truly inspiring event, with hundreds of people marching through the streets, waving rainbow flags and chanting slogans.
I have heard about it, and I'm so glad to see that Mozambique is making progress in this area. But I'm also curious to know more about the LGBT community in Saint Kitts and Nevis. How does it compare to Mozambique in terms of inclusivity and acceptance?
Well, from what I've researched, Saint Kitts and Nevis is a relatively small but vibrant LGBT community. While there is still some stigma and prejudice, there are many organizations and individuals working to promote LGBT rights and visibility.
That's great to hear, Mira. But I'm also aware that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a strong Christian tradition, which can sometimes be at odds with LGBT rights. How do you think the government and society can balance these competing values?
That's a great question. I think it's all about education and awareness. By educating people about the importance of inclusivity and acceptance, we can create a more welcoming and supportive environment for LGBT individuals.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the progress that has been made so far. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a long history of tolerance and acceptance. And I believe that this can be built upon to create a more inclusive society.
Absolutely. And speaking of progress, I'm curious to know more about the LGBT community in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Are there any notable organizations or events that promote LGBT rights and visibility?
Actually, there is a wonderful organization called the Rainbow Alliance, which works to promote LGBT rights and visibility in Saint Kitts and Nevis. They also organize events and activities to raise awareness and promote inclusivity.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Leo, I'm so glad to hear about it. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it as well. If you think this is something that our listeners would be interested in, please let us know in the comments below.
I think it's definitely worth exploring further, Mira. And I'm also curious to know more about the challenges that the LGBT community in Saint Kitts and Nevis faces. How do you think the community can overcome these challenges and achieve greater visibility and acceptance?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's all about building alliances and partnerships with other organizations and individuals who share similar values and goals. By working together, we can create a more supportive and inclusive environment for LGBT individuals.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the resilience and determination of the LGBT community in Saint Kitts and Nevis. Despite the challenges they face, they continue to push forward and advocate for their rights.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis can learn from each other's experiences and strategies. By sharing knowledge and best practices, we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment for LGBT individuals in both countries.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth exploring the role of technology and social media in promoting LGBT rights and visibility. How do you think social media can be used to raise awareness and promote inclusivity?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, I think social media can be a powerful tool for promoting LGBT rights and visibility. By using hashtags and sharing stories and experiences, we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment for LGBT individuals.
I completely agree. Mira, and I think it's also worth noting that social media can also be used to challenge and dismantle discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. By using social media to raise awareness and promote inclusivity, we can create a more supportive and inclusive environment for LGBT individuals.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis have a lot to learn from each other's experiences and strategies. By sharing knowledge and best practices, we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment for LGBT individuals in both countries.
That's a great point. Mira, and I think it's also worth exploring the role of education and awareness in promoting LGBT rights and visibility. How do you think education can be used to promote inclusivity and acceptance?
That's a great question. Leo, I think education can be a powerful tool for promoting LGBT rights and visibility. By educating people about the importance of inclusivity and acceptance, we can create a more welcoming and supportive environment for LGBT individuals.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that education can also be used to challenge and dismantle discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. By using education to raise awareness and promote inclusivity, we can create a more supportive and inclusive environment for LGBT individuals.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis have made significant progress in recent years in promoting LGBT rights and visibility. By continuing to work together and share knowledge and best practices, we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment for LGBT individuals in both countries.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth exploring the role of community and social support in promoting LGBT rights and visibility. How do you think community and social support can be used to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for LGBT individuals?
That's a great question. Leo, I think community and social support can be a powerful tool for promoting LGBT rights and visibility. By building strong and supportive communities, we can create a more inclusive and welcoming environment for LGBT individuals.
I completely agree, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that community and social support can also be used to challenge and dismantle discriminatory attitudes and behaviors. By using community and social support to raise awareness and promote inclusivity, we can create a more supportive and inclusive environment for LGBT individuals.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis have a lot to learn from each other's experiences and strategies. By sharing, I'm loving the vibe of this topic. And I'm sure our listeners are too. Dive into the wonderful world of hospitality in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. I'm
more than Mira. I'm like a kid in a candy store, ready to explore the warm and fuzzy side of these two countries. And I have to say, Mozambique has a special place in my heart. The people, the culture, the food, it's all just so rich and vibrant.
Rich and vibrant. I love it. And speaking of rich and vibrant, I think Saint Kitts and Nevis has its own unique charm. The island vibes, the beautiful beaches. It's like a tropical paradise. But I'm curious, Leo, what makes you think Mozambique is so special?
Well, Mira, I think it's the way the Mozambicans welcome you with open arms. They have this amazing tradition of hospitality where they invite you to share meals, drink tea, and just generally hang out. It's like they're saying, come on in, friend, and let's have some fun.
That sounds amazing. And I think St. Kitts and Nevis has a similar approach. The locals are so friendly and welcoming. It's like they're saying, hey, you're part of the family now. But I've heard that in St. Kitts and Nevis, there's also a strong emphasis on respecting tradition. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Yes. In St. Kitts and Nevis, you'll find a strong sense of respect for elders and tradition. It's like they're saying, Hey, we got a rich history and culture, and we're proud of it. And that's something that I think is really admirable.
I completely agree, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries are proud of their heritage. But I'm also curious. What about the language barrier? I've heard that in Mozambique, English is not as widely spoken as it is in Saint Kitts and Nevis. How do you think that affects the experience for foreigners?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, and I think it's true that in Mozambique, English is not as widely spoken. But that's actually a great opportunity for foreigners to learn some Portuguese and connect with the locals on a deeper level. And besides, even if you don't speak the language, the Mozambicans will still try to communicate with you and make you feel welcome.
That's so true. And I think it's a great example of how hospitality can transcend language barriers. But I'm also curious. What about the cost of living? I've heard that in Saint Kitts and Nevis, it can be quite expensive. How does that compare to Mozambique?
Oh, that's a great question, Mira. And I think it's true that St. Kitts and Nevis can be quite expensive. But I think that's also because it's a small island nation with a strong economy. Mozambique, on the other hand, has a more developing economy, so the cost of living is actually quite reasonable.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries have their own unique economic situations. But I'm also curious, what about the cultural differences? I've heard that in Mozambique, there's a strong emphasis on family and community. Can you tell us more about that?
Ah, yes. In Mozambique, family and community are at the heart of everything. It's like they're saying, we're all in this together. And that's something that I think is really beautiful. And I think St. Kitts and Nevis also has a strong sense of community, especially in the smaller towns and villages.
I completely agree, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries have a strong sense of community. But I'm also curious, what about the expat experience? I've heard that in St. Kitts and Nevis, there's a growing expat community. Can you tell us more about that?
Ah, yes. In St. Kitts and Nevis, there's a growing expat community. And it's actually becoming a bit of a hub for digital nomads and remote workers. And I think that's really exciting, because it's creating opportunities for people to connect and collaborate across cultures.
I love that, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries are welcoming expats and digital nomads. But I'm also curious, what about the language of love? I've heard that in Mozambique, Portuguese is the language of love. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, it's English. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, that's a great question, Mira. And I think it's true that in Mozambique, Portuguese is the language of love. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, it's English. But I think that's also because language is such a powerful tool for connection and communication. And I think both countries are doing a great job of promoting language learning and cultural exchange.
I completely agree. And I think it's great that both countries are promoting language learning and cultural exchange. But I'm also curious, what about the importance of language in hospitality? I've heard that in Mozambique, language is a key part of the hospitality experience. Can you tell us more about that?
Ah, yes. In Mozambique, language is indeed a key part of the hospitality experience. It's like they're saying, come on in, friend, and let's communicate in our beautiful Portuguese. And I think that's something that St. Kitts and Nevis could also learn from.
I love that, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries are prioritizing language and cultural exchange. But I'm also curious, what about the role of food in hospitality? I've heard that in St. Kitts and Nevis, food is a big part of the hospitality experience. Can you tell us more about that?
Ah, yes. In St. Kitts and Nevis, food is indeed a big part of the hospitality experience. It's like they're saying, come on in, friend, and let's share a meal together. And I think that's something that Mozambique could also learn from.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think it's great that both countries are prioritizing food and cultural exchange. But I'm also curious, what about the importance of respect in hospitality? I've heard that in Saint Kitts and Nevis, respect is a key part of the hospitality experience. Can you tell us more about that?
Ah, yes. In St. Kitts and Nevis, respect is indeed a key part of the hospitality experience. It's like they're saying, we value your presence here, and we want to show you respect. And I think that's...
Tied into the digital landscape of Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried navigating the internet in Mozambique? The speeds can be quite unpredictable.
Unpredictable is an understatement. I was there for a festival, and my data kept dropping. But you know what they say, Mozambique's internet is like the country's roads, unpredictable. Always an adventure.
That's so true. But seriously, Mozambique is making strides in its digital infrastructure. They're investing in fiber optic cables and improving their mobile networks. What about St. Kitts and Nevis? Have you heard about their digital initiatives?
Ah, yes. St. Kitts and Nevis has a robust digital infrastructure, with high-speed internet and a well-developed IT sector. In fact, they're one of the most digitally advanced countries in the Caribbean.
That's impressive. I've heard that St. Kitts and Nevis has a strong focus on e-government services, making it easier for citizens to access public services online. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Absolutely. They've implemented a range of online services, from tax payments to passport applications, making it easier for citizens to interact with the government. And, of course, they're also working to improve their digital literacy programs, so everyone can benefit from this new digital landscape.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think that digital literacy programs are essential for a country's development? Should governments prioritize investing in these programs?
Well, I think it's essential. But let's not forget that Mozambique has some of the most innovative startups in Africa. They're using tech to solve real-world problems, like improving healthcare and education.
That's right. Mozambique's tech scene is growing rapidly, and they're making strides in areas like e-commerce and digital payments. But, Leo, what about the challenges of digital infrastructure in Mozambique? How do you think they can improve their internet speeds and connectivity?
That's a great question. I think they need to invest in more infrastructure, like undersea cables and data centers. And, of course, they need to work on their digital literacy programs to ensure that everyone has access to the internet and can use it effectively.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me that digital infrastructure is a top priority. But, Leo, what about St. Kitts and Nevis? What do you think sets their digital infrastructure apart from Mozambique's?
Well, St. Kitts and Nevis has a more established IT sector, with a range of tech companies and startups operating there. They also have a well-developed digital ecosystem, with online services and platforms that make it easy for citizens to access public services.
That's really interesting. And, Leo, I'm curious, do you think that St. Kitts and Nevis's digital infrastructure is more geared towards tourism or local development?
That's a great question. I think they're focused on both. Actually, they want to attract tourists with their digital services and platforms. But they also want to develop their local economy through e-commerce and other digital initiatives.
I see. Well, it's clear that both countries are making strides in their digital infrastructure. But, Leo, what about the challenges of digital infrastructure in St. Kitts and Nevis? How do you think they can improve their internet speeds and connectivity?
That's a great question. I think they need to invest in more infrastructure, like fiber optic cables and data centers. And, of course, they need to work on their digital literacy programs to ensure that everyone has access to the internet and can use it effectively.
I'm curious. Leo, do you think interested in learning more about the tech scene in Mozambique? Maybe we can do a follow-up episode on that?
Absolutely. I think that would be a great idea. And, who knows? Maybe we can even get some of our listeners to share their own experiences with digital infrastructure in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis.
Well, there you have it, folks. Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis may have different digital landscapes, but they're both making strides in their digital infrastructure. And we want to hear from you. What do you think about digital infrastructure in these countries? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below.
And remember, if you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. We want to hear your opinions and insights on this topic.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for joining us on this episode of our podcast. We'll be back with more exciting topics and discussions. Stay connected and keep on exploring.
And remember, the internet may be unpredictable, but with our podcast, you'll always have a reliable connection to the latest news and discussions on digital infrastructure and tech trends.
When it comes to shopping, I think Mozambique has a unique charm. The markets in Maputo are a treasure trove of local handicrafts and souvenirs. You can find everything from colorful textiles to intricate wood carvings.
That's right. Yeah, and the best part is that you can haggle your way to a great deal. The vendors are used to negotiating prices, so it's all part of the fun. But I have to say, some of the products can be a bit unusual.
Oh, I know what you mean. I once saw a vendor selling what looked like a vintage typewriter, but it turned out to be a toy. I was like, is that a typewriter or a toy? The vendor just smiled and said, it's a typewriter, of sorts.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of shopping in Mozambique. You never know what you're going to find. But if you're looking for something more structured, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a great shopping scene too.
Ah, yes. I've heard that the shopping malls in Lassiter are quite modern and well-stocked. And, of course, there's the famous Frigate Bay Beach, which is a great place to find local handicrafts and souvenirs.
That's right. And as a bonus, the prices in Saint Kitts and Nevis are generally lower than in Mozambique. So, if you're looking for value for money, Saint Kitts and Nevis might be the way to go.
But not forget about the local markets in Mozambique. They're a great place to find authentic, handmade products. And, as I said, the vendors are always happy to haggle.
Oh, I'm sure they are. But I think we should also mention that the shopping scene in Saint Kitts and Nevis is a bit more refined. You know, more upscale.
Oh, so you're saying that Saint Kitts and Nevis is for people who like their shopping a bit more luxurious?
Well, maybe. But, hey, if you're looking for a more high-end shopping experience, Saint Kitts and Nevis has got it.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know that they can find luxury shopping in Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Of course. And who knows? Maybe they'll even find a few bargains along the way.
Oh, I'm sure they will. But let's not forget about the markets in Mozambique. They're a great place to find unique, handmade products.
That's right. And, as I said, the vendors are always happy to haggle. So, it's a win-win situation.
I think we've established that both countries have their own unique shopping scenes. No, it's up to our listeners to decide which one they prefer.
That's right. And, who knows, maybe they'll even find a few bargains along the way.
Oh, I'm sure they will. And, as always, we'd love to hear from our listeners. What do you think about the shopping scenes in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis? Do you prefer the markets in Mozambique or the malls in Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Well, maybe we'll get some feedback from our listeners. But, until then, it's time to wrap up this episode.
That's right. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting episodes. Dive into the vibrant cultural scene of Mozambique, shall we? I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me when I say that the annual NHMS Festival is a must-see event. It's a traditional dance celebration that showcases the rich cultural heritage of the Tsonga people. These insights could have been possible without Jetoff. I'm referring to cultural trends.
Oh, yes. The NHMS Festival is indeed a highlight of Mozambique's cultural calendar. But have you ever been to a traditional Mozambican wedding? I mean, the music, the dancing, the food, it's a real treat. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a sucker for a good wedding cake.
Well, I think we can both agree that Mozambican weddings are a celebration to remember. But let's not forget about the country's rich musical heritage. Mozambican music is a fusion of traditional and modern styles, with a strong emphasis on percussion and dance. And have you heard of the legendary Mozambican musician, Simauti Hale?
Yes. Simauti Hale is a true legend in Mozambican music. But I think we should also talk about the country's vibrant art scene. Mozambique has a thriving community of artists, with a focus on traditional crafts like wood carvings and textiles. And I'm not just talking about the usual touristy stuff, I'm talking about genuine, authentic art that reflects the country's unique cultural identity.
That's so true. Leo. And speaking of cultural identity, have you ever been to the Maputo Museum of Art? It's a fantastic museum that showcases the country's rich artistic heritage. And if you're looking for something a bit more off the beaten path, I recommend checking out the Mozambican National Gallery, which features a stunning collection of modern and contemporary art.
I think we're getting a bit sidetracked here. Mira, but let's get back to the topic at hand, cultural events and festivals. So, what's the deal with the Mozambican festivals? Are they all as colorful and lively as the NHMS UA festival?
Well, I think we can safely say that Mozambican festivals are always a blast. But, in all seriousness, the country has a rich tradition of cultural celebrations, from the NHMS UA festival to the Mozambican Independence Day celebrations. And let's not forget about the annual Mozambique Music Festival, which showcases the country's diverse musical talents.
I see what you did there. Mira, you're trying to sneak in some more information about Mozambique's cultural scene. But I'm not buying it. I think we should also talk about Saint Kitts and Nevis. I mean, what's the cultural scene like in these two tiny islands?
Okay. But let's not forget about Mozambique just yet. After all, we're still in the middle of discussing its cultural events and festivals. But I suppose we can take a brief detour to talk about Saint Kitts and Nevis. So, have you ever been to a traditional Kittian or Nevisian festival?
Yes, I have. And let me tell you, it's a real treat. The cultural scene in Saint Kitts and Nevis is all about celebrating the island's rich history and heritage. And have you heard about the annual Sugarmas Festival? It's a massive celebration of music, dance, and culture that's not to be missed.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and I think we should also talk about the country's vibrant art scene. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a thriving community of artists, with a focus on traditional crafts like wood carvings and textiles. And I'm not just talking about the usual touristy stuff, I'm talking about genuine, authentic art that reflects the country's unique cultural identity.
I see what you did there. Mira, you're trying to sneak in some more information about Saint Kitts and Nevis's cultural scene. But I'm not buying it. I think we should also talk about the country's rich musical heritage. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a unique blend of traditional and modern styles, with a strong emphasis on calypso and soca music.
I think we're getting a bit carried away here. Leo. But, in all seriousness, the country's musical heritage is indeed rich and diverse. And speaking of music, have you ever been to a traditional Kittian or Nevisian concert? I mean, it's a real treat. The energy is electric, and the music is infectious.
Yes, I have. And let me tell you, it's a real experience. The cultural scene in Saint Kitts and Nevis is all about celebrating the island's rich history and heritage. And have you heard about the annual Jazz and Blues Festival? It's a fantastic celebration of music that's not to be missed.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and I think we should also talk about the country's vibrant festivals and celebrations. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a rich tradition of cultural events, from the Sugarmas Festival to the Nevis Festival of Culture. And let's not forget about the annual Saint Kitts and Nevis Independence Day celebrations, which are always a highlight of the cultural calendar.
I see what you did there. Mira, you're trying to sneak in some more information about Saint Kitts and Nevis's cultural scene. But I'm not buying it. I think we should also talk about the country's unique cultural blend. Saint Kitts and Nevis is a melting pot of cultures, with influences from Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean. And I think that's what makes its cultural scene so unique and fascinating.
I think we're getting a bit carried away here, Leo. But, in all seriousness, the country's cultural blend is indeed unique and fascinating. And speaking of cultural events and festivals, I think we should wrap up this topic by saying that both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis have a rich and diverse cultural scene. From traditional festivals to modern art and music, there's always something new to discover in these two countries.
I agree. Mira, and I think we've covered just about everything we need to cover in this topic. But before we move on to the next topic, let me just say that I'm impressed by the cultural scene in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. It's truly a celebration of the unique and the diverse.
Thank you. Leo, I think we've done a great job of highlighting the cultural events and festivals in both countries, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights we've shared. But if you want to learn more about Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, I recommend checking out Jetoff AI for more information on cultural trends and events. I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would agree with me that learning the local language is a fantastic way to connect with the culture and the people. And, let's be honest, it's a great way to get a job or start a business in the country. But, I have to ask, Leo, what's the situation like for learning Portuguese in Mozambique?
Good question. Mira, in Mozambique, you'll find that many people speak Portuguese, especially in urban areas like Maputo and Beira. However, the local language, Chichua, is also widely spoken. But, I have to say, as a comedian, I find it hilarious that Mozambicans will often switch between Portuguese and Chichua in the same sentence, making it quite a challenge for foreigners to learn.
That's so true. Leo, I've been there too. But, seriously, what about language schools in Mozambique? Are they well established and accessible to foreigners?
Yes. Mozambique has a growing number of language schools, especially in Maputo and Beira. They offer a range of courses, from beginner to advanced levels, and some even offer cultural immersion programs. However, I've heard that the quality can vary, and it's essential to do your research before choosing a school.
That's great advice. Leo, speaking of cultural immersion, what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? How does the language learning process work there?
Well, Saint Kitts and Nevis is a bit different. Mira, the official language is English, and it's widely spoken throughout the country. However, you'll also find that many people speak a local dialect called Kittitian Creole, which is a mix of Africa, European, and indigenous influences.
That's fascinating. Leo, I've heard that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a strong focus on English language education. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a well-established education system, and English is the primary language of instruction. However, I've also heard that the country is working to promote the local dialect, Kittitian Creole, as a way to preserve its cultural heritage.
That's great to hear. Leo, let's talk about the challenges of learning a new language. What are some common mistakes that foreigners make when trying to learn Portuguese in Mozambique?
Well, Mia, I think one common mistake is trying to pronounce the Portuguese or sound, which is quite different from the English or sound. And, of course, there's the infamous Portuguese verb conjugation, which can be a real challenge for foreigners.
Oh, yes. I remember struggling with that too. But what about resources for learning the local language in Mozambique? Are there any online resources or language learning apps that can help?
Yes. There are several online resources and language learning apps that can help you learn Portuguese in Mozambique. Some popular ones include Duolingo, Babbel, and Rosetta Stone. However, I've also heard that many language schools in Mozambique offer their own online courses and resources.
That's great to know. Leo, and let's talk about the benefits of learning a new language. What are some advantages of speaking Portuguese in Mozambique?
Well, Mira, speaking Portuguese in Mozambique can open up many doors for you. Not only can you communicate with locals, but you can also access job opportunities, cultural events, and even government services. And, of course, it's a great way to connect with the local culture and people.
That's so true. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that learning a new language is a rewarding experience. But what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? What are some benefits of speaking English in this country?
Yes. Speaking English in Saint Kitts and Nevis can give you access to many opportunities, from tourism to business and education. And, of course, it's a great way to connect with the local culture and people. Plus, it's a beautiful country with a rich history and culture.
That's so true. Leo, and let's talk about the importance of language in a country's culture. What role does language play in preserving cultural heritage in Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Well, Mira, language plays a significant role in preserving cultural heritage in Saint Kitts and Nevis. The local dialect, Kittitian Creole, is a unique blend of African, European, and indigenous influences, and it's an essential part of the country's cultural identity.
That's fascinating. Leo, and finally, what advice would you give to our listeners who are interested in learning a new language in Mozambique or Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Well, Mira, I would say that learning a new language takes time and effort. But it's definitely worth it. Start with the basics. Practice regularly. And immerse yourself in the language and culture as much as possible. And, of course, don't be afraid to make mistakes that are an essential part of the learning process.
That's great advice. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights you shared with us today. Thanks for joining me, Leo, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation about opportunities of learning the local language in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. I'm to dive into the safety and comfort aspects for women travelers in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. Let's start with Mozambique, where women travelers often face harassment and violence. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to feel safe when exploring a new country.
Absolutely. Mira, Mozambique has a high rate of reported crimes against women, including rape and assault. However, the government has implemented initiatives to combat these issues, such as the creation of a women's police unit and awareness campaigns to promote respect for women's rights.
That's a great start. Leo? But what about community initiatives? I've heard that some local organizations are working to create safe spaces for women to socialize and connect.
Yes, Mira. One such organization is the Mozambican Women's Association, which provides training and resources for women to become more empowered and independent. They also offer support groups for women who have experienced violence or harassment.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate learning more about these initiatives. In St. Kitts and Nevis, I've heard that the culture is generally very welcoming and respectful towards women.
That's right. Mira, St. Kitts and Nevis has a strong tradition of respecting women's rights and promoting equality. In fact, the country has a dedicated Ministry of Gender Affairs, which works to address issues related to women's empowerment and safety.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that having a dedicated ministry is a great step towards creating a safer environment for women. But what about personal experiences? Have you or our listeners ever had any experiences with harassment or violence in these countries?
Well, Mira, I've had some close calls in Mozambique, but I've also had some wonderful experiences with the locals. One time, I was walking through a market and a group of women started chatting with me and inviting me to join them for tea. It was a really lovely experience.
Ah, that's so sweet. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that experience. In St. Kitts and Nevis, I've heard that the island is generally very safe, but it's still essential to take precautions.
Yes, Mira. St. Kitts and Nevis has a low crime rate, but it's always a good idea to be aware of your surroundings and take necessary precautions, especially at night. But overall, The island has a very welcoming and friendly atmosphere.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing more about the safety and comfort aspects of these countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's essential to note that both countries have made significant strides in promoting women's rights and safety. But there's still work to be done. I'm curious to hear from our listeners. Have you or anyone you know had any experiences with harassment or violence in these countries?
Well, Leo, I think it's essential to address the issue of harassment and violence. But I also believe that it's essential to focus on the positive aspects of these countries. After all, women travelers can have amazing experiences in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think that's what our podcast is all about, highlighting the positive aspects of travel and exploring the world in a safe and respectful way. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on this. Mira.
No problem. Leo! I'm just glad we could have this conversation and share some valuable insights with our listeners. Let's move on to the next topic. Perhaps we can discuss some of the amazing cultural experiences that women travelers can have in these countries.
Sounds like a great idea. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. And who knows, maybe we can even convince some of our listeners to plan a trip to Mozambique or Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Oh, that's the spirit. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any recommendations or advice we can provide. If you have any tips or stories about traveling in these countries, please share them with us in the comments.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation. Thanks for joining me, Mira, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
To dive into the fascinating world of Mozambique's legal system, I'm curious to know, Leo, how does the country's constitution protect individual rights and freedoms?
Great question. Mira, Mozambique's constitution is indeed robust in its protections. Article 16, for instance, guarantees the right to freedom of expression, which is a crucial aspect of any democratic society. But, I must say, it's not without its challenges. I've heard stories of journalists facing intimidation and even violence while doing their job.
That's concerning. I'm sure our listeners would agree that freedom of expression is a fundamental right. In fact, I'm certain that our listeners living in Mozambique would appreciate the efforts of organizations like the Media Institute of Southern Africa, which works tirelessly to promote press freedom and support journalists in the region.
Absolutely. Mira, and it's not just about the Constitution. It's also about the everyday practices of the justice system. For example, Mozambique has a well-established system of public defenders, which ensures that individuals have access to quality legal representation, especially in cases where they cannot afford it.
That's a great point. Leo, public defenders play a vital role in ensuring that the justice system is fair and accessible to all. And speaking of accessibility, I'm curious to know how Mozambique's legal system compares to that of Saint Kitts and Nevis. Have you had a chance to explore the legal framework of our second country?
Yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a unique legal system. Mira, as a Commonwealth country, it has inherited many of the principles of British common law. But what's interesting is that it has also adopted some of the features of civil law, particularly in the areas of contract and property law.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a reputation for being a haven for financial secrecy. But how does this affect individual rights and freedoms, particularly in terms of transparency and accountability?
Well, Mira, it's a complex issue. On the one hand, Saint Kitts and Nevis has implemented various measures to promote transparency and accountability, such as the establishment of a Financial Services Regulatory Commission. On the other hand, the country's reputation for financial secrecy can make it challenging for individuals to access information and hold those in power accountable.
I see what you mean. Leah, it's a delicate balance between promoting economic growth and protecting individual rights and freedoms. But what about the role of the judiciary in both countries? How does the judiciary contribute to the protection of individual rights and freedoms?
That's a great question. Mira, In both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, the judiciary plays a crucial role in ensuring that individual rights and freedoms are protected. However, the nature of this role can vary significantly between the two countries. For example, in Mozambique, the judiciary has been instrumental in promoting constitutionalism and upholding the rule of law, particularly in cases where the government has been accused of human rights abuses.
That's impressive. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, how does the judiciary ensure that individual rights and freedoms are protected?
Well, Nira, in Saint Kitts and Nevis, the judiciary has a reputation for being independent and impartial. However, there have been concerns raised about the judiciary's ability to hold the government accountable, particularly in cases where the government has been accused of corruption or human rights abuses.
I see what you mean. It's clear that both countries have their unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to protecting individual rights and freedoms. But what about the role of civil society in promoting individual rights and freedoms in both countries?
That's a great question. Nira, in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, civil society has played a crucial role in promoting individual rights and freedoms. For example, in Mozambique, organizations like the Mozambican Association of Journalists have worked tirelessly to promote press freedom and support journalists in the region.
That's fantastic. Leah, and in Saint Kitts and Nevis, how does civil society contribute to the protection of individual rights and freedoms?
Well, Nira, in Saint Kitts and Nevis, civil society has been instrumental in promoting transparency and accountability, particularly in the areas of financial regulation and human rights. For example, organizations like the Saint Kitts and Nevis Human Rights Commission have worked to promote awareness about human rights issues and advocate for the protection of individual rights and freedoms.
I see what you mean. Leo, it's clear that both countries have a vibrant civil society that is committed to promoting individual rights and freedoms. But what about the challenges that civil society faces in both countries? How can we address these challenges and promote greater protection of individual rights and freedoms?
That's a great question. Mira, in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, civil society faces various challenges, including lack of resources, intimidation, and even violence. However, there are also many opportunities for civil society to promote individual rights and freedoms, particularly through awareness-raising campaigns and advocacy efforts.
I see what you mean. Leo, it's clear that both countries have a complex and nuanced legal system that requires careful consideration and analysis. But what about our listeners? What do you think our listeners would say about the legal system in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Well, Nira, I think our listeners would likely have a range of opinions on the matter. Some might praise the efforts of organizations like the Media Institute of Southern Africa in Mozambique, while others might criticize the government's handling of human rights abuses. Similarly, in Saint Kitts and Nevis, some might praise the judiciary's independence and impartiality, while others might criticize the government's lack of transparency and accountability.
I see what you mean. Leo, it's clear that both countries have a complex and multifaceted legal system that requires careful consideration and analysis. But what about the future? What do you think the future holds for the legal system in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
That's a great question. Mira, in both countries, there are many challenges ahead, including the need to promote greater transparency and accountability, particularly in the areas of financial regulation and human rights. However, there are also many opportunities for reform and improvement, particularly through the efforts of civil society and the judiciary.
I see what you mean. Leo, it's clear that both countries have a bright future ahead, with many opportunities for reform and improvement. And speaking of opportunities, I'm curious to know, Leo, what advice would you give to our listeners who are interested in learning more about the legal system in both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis?
Well, Mira, I would advise our listeners to stay informed and engaged on these issues. There are many resources available, including online databases, academic journals, and civil society organizations. By staying informed and engaged, our listeners can play a vital role in promoting greater.
So, when it comes to spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities, Mozambique is definitely a standout. The country's rich natural resources and stunning beaches create the perfect backdrop for a rejuvenating getaway. From luxurious resorts to traditional healing practices, Mozambique offers a unique blend of modern and traditional wellness experiences.
Ah, yes. And what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? I've heard their spas are top-notch, with a focus on natural ingredients and holistic practices. But let's get real. Who needs a spa when you have the crystal-clear waters and breathtaking scenery of these two islands?
Well, I think you're selling the spa short. Leo! Saint Kitts and Nevis do have some amazing spas. But Mozambique's unique cultural heritage and traditional healing practices make it a true gem. I'm curious, have you ever tried a traditional Mozambican massage?
No. I don't think I've had the pleasure, but I'm sure it's a real treat. You know, I've heard that Mozambican massage is all about using natural oils and herbs to relax the muscles and soothe the mind. Sounds like just what I need after a long day of traveling.
Exactly. And it's not just about the massage itself, but also about the cultural experience. In Mozambique, traditional healing is deeply rooted in the community, and it's a way of connecting with the land and the people. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about this.
Absolutely. And speaking of cultural experiences, I've heard that St. Kitts and Nevis have a strong focus on wellness and self-care. They even have a wellness festival every year, which celebrates healthy living and relaxation. Have you ever been to a wellness festival, Mira?
Oh, yes. I've been to a few wellness festivals in my time, and they're always such a wonderful experience. The energy is palpable, and it's a great way to connect with like-minded people. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Wellness Festival in Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Well, I'm sure it's a real treat. But let's not forget about the food. Mira, I've heard that Mozambican cuisine is all about hearty, comforting dishes like peri-peri chicken and matapa. And St. Kitts and Nevis have their own unique take on Caribbean cuisine, with a focus on fresh seafood and local ingredients. Which one do you think is better? Mira?
Oh, that's a tough one. Leah, I think both countries have their own unique culinary traditions, and it's hard to say which one is better. But I will say that Mozambican cuisine has a certain Genie says quo. There's something about the combination of spices and flavors that just can't be beat.
Come on. Mira, you can't seriously be saying that Mozambican cuisine is better than St. Kitts and Nevis. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the culinary traditions of both countries.
Well, I think it's time for us to get back to the topic at hand. Leo, which country offers the best spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities? I think it's clear that both countries have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. But, in the end, it comes down to personal preference.
Absolutely. And speaking of personal preference, I think our listeners would love to know more about the different types of spas and wellness centers in both countries. From luxury resorts to holistic retreats, there's something for everyone. What do you think? Mira? Should we delve deeper into the world of spa and wellness in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis?
Oh, absolutely. I think our listeners would love to hear more about the different types of spas and wellness centers in both countries. And who knows, maybe we'd even convince some of them to try out a traditional Mozambican massage or two.
Well, I'm sure that's a possibility. Mira, but in the meantime, let's get back to the conversation at hand. What do you think is the key to finding the perfect spa or wellness center in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis?
That's a great question. Leah, I think the key is to find a place that offers a unique and authentic experience. Whether it's a traditional Mozambican massage or a holistic retreat in St. Kitts and Nevis, it's all about finding something that speaks to you on a deeper level.
Absolutely. And speaking of unique experiences, I've heard that Mozambique has some of the most beautiful and secluded beaches in the world. Have you ever been to one of these beaches, Mira?
Oh, yes. I've been to a few of the more secluded beaches in Mozambique. and they're truly breathtaking. The crystal clear waters and stunning scenery make for the perfect relaxing getaway.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different beaches in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. From secluded coves to bustling beach towns, there's something for everyone.
Absolutely. And speaking of bustling beach towns, I think our listeners would love to know more about the different types of accommodations in both countries, from luxury resorts to cozy beach cottages. There's something for every budget and style.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of accommodations in both countries. But let's not forget about the activities. Mira, I've heard that Mozambique has some of the best surfing and snorkeling in the world, and St. Kitts and Nevis have their own unique take on water sports, with a focus on sailing and kayaking.
Oh, yes. I've heard that Mozambique has some of the best surfing and snorkeling in the world. And St. Kitts and Nevis have their own unique take on water sports, with a focus on sailing and kayaking. I think our listeners would love to know more about the different activities available in both countries.
Absolutely. And speaking of activities, I think our listeners would love to know more about the different types of cuisine in both countries. From traditional Mozambican dishes like peri-peri chicken and matapa to the fresh seafood and local ingredients of St. Kitts and Nevis, there's something for every palate.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. Leo, I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about the sport, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis.
Absolutely. And
So, when it comes to Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis, I'm curious to see how these two countries approach religious and spiritual needs. I mean, Mozambique has a rich history of Islamic, Christian, and indigenous beliefs, while St. Kitts and Nevis has a mix of Christianity, African diasporic traditions, and Hinduism.
that's a great point. Mira, Mozambique's cultural diversity is truly fascinating. I've heard that the country has a strong tradition of Islamic architecture, with beautiful mosques like the Grand Mosque in Maputo.
Ah, yes. And St. Kitts and Nevis has its own unique blend of cultures. I've been told that the island has a strong Christian heritage, but also a thriving Hindu community. In fact, I've heard that the island's Hindu temple, the Sri Lakshmi Narayan Temple, is one of the most beautiful in the Caribbean.
That's really interesting. Mira, I've also heard that St. Kitts and Nevis has a strong emphasis on community and social responsibility, which is reflected in the country's many religious and spiritual festivals. For example, the island's Hindu community celebrates the Festival of Holi with great enthusiasm.
I can imagine. And Mozambique has its own vibrant festivals, like the Mozambican Independence Day celebrations, which often feature traditional music and dance. But I'm curious, Leo, how do you think the two countries approach the issue of freedom of religion?
Well, Mira, both countries have a strong tradition of religious tolerance and freedom. In Mozambique, the government has a policy of promoting interfaith dialogue and cooperation, which has helped to create a more harmonious and inclusive society.
That's wonderful to hear. And St. Kitts and Nevis has a similar approach, with a strong emphasis on promoting understanding and respect between different religious communities. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think our listeners think about this?
Good question. Mira, I think our listeners would agree that promoting interfaith understanding and respect is essential for building a more harmonious and inclusive society.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that both countries are taking steps to promote this kind of understanding. But I'm also curious. Leo, how do you think the two countries approach the issue of spirituality and community support?
Well, Mira, both countries have a strong tradition of community-based spirituality, with many people turning to faith and spirituality as a way of coping with the challenges of everyday life.
That makes sense. And I think it's great that both countries are promoting community-based initiatives to support people's spiritual needs. But I'm also curious. Leo, how do you think the two countries compare in terms of their approach to spiritual growth and development?
Good question. Mira, I think both countries have a lot to offer in terms of spiritual growth and development. but in different ways. Mozambique has a strong tradition of spiritual practices like meditation and yoga, which are becoming increasingly popular in the West.
That's really interesting. Leo. And Saint Kitts and Nevis has its own unique approach to spiritual growth, with many people turning to nature-based spirituality and ecotourism as a way of connecting with the natural world.
Exactly. And I think it's great that both countries are promoting these kinds of initiatives, which can help people to connect with their own spirituality and sense of purpose.
Absolutely. And I think it's also great that both countries are promoting interfaith dialogue and cooperation, which can help to build bridges between different religious communities. I'm actually curious to know, have you ever participated in any interfaith dialogue or cooperation initiatives? Leo?
Yes. Mira, I've had the opportunity to participate in several interfaith dialogue initiatives, and I can tell you that it's always a rewarding and enriching experience.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, and I think it's great that you're promoting interfaith understanding and respect. But I'm also curious, what do you think our listeners can learn from the experiences of these two countries?
Good question. Mira, I think our listeners can learn a lot from the experiences of these two countries, particularly in terms of promoting interfaith understanding and respect, and finding ways to support people's spiritual needs.
Absolutely. And I think it's also great that both countries are promoting community-based initiatives to support people's spiritual needs. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think our listeners think about this?
Good question. Mira, I think our listeners would agree that promoting community-based initiatives to support people's spiritual needs is essential for building a more harmonious and inclusive society.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that both countries are taking steps to promote this kind of understanding. But I'm also curious. Leo, how do you think the two countries compare in terms of their approach to spiritual growth and development?
Good question. Mira, I think both countries have a lot to offer in terms of spiritual growth and development, but in different ways. And I think it's great that they're promoting these kinds of initiatives, which can help people to connect with their own spirituality and sense of purpose.
Absolutely. And I think it's also great that both countries are promoting interfaith dialogue and cooperation, which can help to build bridges between different religious communities. I'm actually curious to know, have you ever participated in any interfaith dialogue or cooperation initiatives? Leah?
Yes. Mira, I've had the opportunity to participate in several interfaith dialogue initiatives, and I can tell you that it's always a rewarding and enriching experience.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, and I think it's great that you're promoting interfaith understanding and respect. But I'm also curious. What do you think our listeners can learn from the experiences of these two countries?
Good question. Mira, I think our listeners can learn a lot from the experiences of these two countries, particularly in terms of promoting interfaith understanding and respect, and finding ways to support people's spiritual needs.
Absolutely. And I think it's also great that both countries are promoting community-based initiatives to support people's spiritual needs. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think our listeners think about this?
Good question. Mira, I think our listeners would agree that promoting community-based initiatives to support people's spiritual needs is essential for building a more harmonious and inclusive society.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that both countries are taking steps to promote this kind of understanding. But I'm also curious. Leo, how do you think the two countries compare in terms of their approach to spiritual growth and development?
Good question. Mira, I think both countries have a lot to offer in terms of spiritual growth and development, but in different ways. And I think it's great that they're promoting these kinds of initiatives, which can help people to connect with their own spirituality.
I'm so to dive into this topic with you. Leo, Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis, two countries with unique stories to tell about social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity.
That's right. Mira, while Mozambique has a rich history of cultural diversity, Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more recent experience with embracing diversity. Let's start with Mozambique's history of colonialism and its impact on the country's social fabric.
Yes. Mozambique was a Portuguese colony for over 4 centuries, which had a profound impact on the country's social and economic structures. The Portuguese brought their own language, culture, and customs, which blended with the indigenous cultures of the region.
Exactly. And this blending of cultures is still evident today in Mozambique's music and cuisine. But despite this rich cultural heritage, Mozambique still faces challenges in terms of social equality and respect for minorities.
I completely agree, Leo. And it's interesting to note that Mozambique has made significant strides in recent years in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minorities. For example, the country has a strong tradition of women's rights and empowerment.
That's right. And Saint Kitts and Nevis, on the other hand, has a more recent history of embracing diversity. The country has a relatively small population, but it's a melting pot of cultures, with a mix of African, European, and indigenous influences.
Oh, yes. And I think it's fascinating to note that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a unique cultural identity that's shaped by its history as a British colony. The country's culture is a blend of African, British, and Caribbean influences.
Exactly. And this blending of cultures is reflected in the country's music, art, and cuisine. But despite this rich cultural heritage, Saint Kitts and Nevis still faces challenges in terms of social equality and respect for minorities.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the key to promoting social equality and respect for minorities in these countries?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the key is education and awareness. Both Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis need to educate their citizens about the importance of social equality and respect for minorities.
I completely agree. Leo, and it's also important to note that both countries have made significant strides in recent years in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minorities. For example, Mozambique has a strong tradition of community-based initiatives that promote social cohesion and respect for minority groups.
That's right. And Saint Kitts and Nevis has also made significant strides in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minorities. For example, the country has a strong tradition of cultural festivals that celebrate its diverse heritage.
Yes. And I think it's fascinating to note that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. For example, in Mozambique, there's a strong tradition of volunteer work and community service.
Exactly. And in Saint Kitts and Nevis, there's a strong sense of community and social responsibility, particularly in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minorities.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the role of social media in promoting social equality and respect for minorities in these countries?
That's a great question. Mira, I think social media can play a powerful role in promoting social equality and respect for minorities by raising awareness and promoting dialogue.
I completely agree. Leo, and it's also important to note that both countries have made significant strides in recent years in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minorities through social media.
That's right. And I think it's fascinating to note that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives that promote social cohesion and respect for minority groups.
Yes. And I think it's also important to note that both countries face challenges in terms of social equality and respect for minorities, particularly in terms of addressing issues of racism and xenophobia.
Exactly. And I think it's crucial that both countries continue to work towards promoting social equality and respect for minorities, particularly in terms of addressing issues of racism and xenophobia.
I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that promoting social equality and respect for minorities is crucial for building a more inclusive and harmonious society.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's also important to note that both countries have a unique opportunity to promote social equality and respect for minorities through their cultural festivals and traditions.
Yes. And I think it's fascinating to note that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility, particularly in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minorities.
Exactly. And I think it's crucial that both countries continue to work towards promoting social equality and respect for minorities, particularly in terms of addressing issues of racism and xenophobia.
If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations on social equality and respect for minorities in different countries around the world.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll be back with more on this topic soon.
Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.
Dive into the taxation system in Mozambique. It's essential for long-term immigrants to understand the tax implications of living in this beautiful country. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever encountered any peculiar tax laws while traveling in Mozambique?
Yes, I remember this one time when I was trying to figure out the tax on a bottle of wine. The shopkeeper told me it was 10% of the value, but then I saw a sign that said 20% tax on wine. I was like, which one is it? He just smiled and said, you're a foreigner. You'll figure it out. So, I guess you could say I'm an expert on Mozambique and wine taxes now.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate some clarification on the tax system. In Mozambique, the tax rate varies depending on the type of income, and there are different tax brackets for individuals and companies. It's essential to understand that the tax authority, the National Tax Authority, is responsible for collecting taxes.
That's right, Mira. And what about Saint Kitts and Nevis? I've heard that they have a more straightforward tax system. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis has a relatively simple tax system, with a flat rate of 15% on income earned within the country. However, there are some tax exemptions for certain types of income, such as investments on certain types of businesses. It's also worth noting that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a citizenship by investment program, which can provide tax benefits for investors.
Wow, that sounds like a great opportunity for investors. But what about retirement? How do long-term immigrants in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis access retirement benefits?
Good question. Leo, in Mozambique, the pension system is based on a contributory scheme, where employees and employers contribute to the pension fund. However, the pension benefits are not very generous, and there are some limitations on access to the pension system for foreign nationals.
I see. And what about St. Kitts and Nevis? Do they have a more comprehensive pension system for foreign nationals?
Saint Kitts and Nevis has a national pension scheme, which provides a range of benefits, including a pension, disability benefits, and survivor benefits. The scheme is not mandatory, and individuals can choose to opt out.
That's interesting. So, it seems that St. Kitts and Nevis has a more comprehensive pension system, but Mozambique has a more straightforward tax system. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the most significant difference between the two countries' approaches to taxation and retirement?
I think it's the level of complexity. Mozambique's tax system is more complex, with multiple tax brackets and exemptions, whereas St. Kitts and Nevis has a simpler system with a flat rate. In terms of retirement, St. Kitts and Nevis has a more comprehensive system with a wider range of benefits.
I agree. Mira, and what about social rights? How do long-term immigrants in Mozambique and St. Kitts and Nevis access social services, such as health care and education?
Good question. Leo, in Mozambique, the social security system is based on a contributory scheme, where employees and employers contribute to the Social Security Fund. However, the benefits are not very generous, and there are some limitations on access to the social services for foreign nationals.
I see. And what about St. Kitts and Nevis? Do they have a more comprehensive social security system for foreign nationals?
Actually, St. Kitts and Nevis has a national health insurance scheme, which provides a range of benefits, including healthcare, education, and social services. However, the scheme is not mandatory, and individuals can choose to opt out.
That's interesting. So it seems that St. Kitts and Nevis has a more comprehensive social security system, but Mozambique has a more straightforward tax system. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the most significant difference between the two countries' approaches to taxation, retirement, and social rights?
I think it's the level of generosity. Saint Kitts and Nevis seems to offer more comprehensive benefits and a wider range of services, whereas Mozambique's benefits are more limited.
I agree. Mira, and what about our listeners? Do you think they would agree with us that Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more comprehensive system?
I'm sure they would. In fact, I'm curious to hear from our listeners. Do you think Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more comprehensive system than Mozambique? Let us know in the comments.
I'm sure they will. And if you think Mozambique has a better system, please let us know that too. We want to hear from you.
So, to summarize, Mozambique has a more complex tax system, but Saint Kitts and Nevis has a more comprehensive pension system and social security system. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the key takeaway from this comparison?
I think it's that long-term immigrants should carefully research and understand the tax implications and benefits of living in each country. It's essential to choose a country that meets their individual needs and preferences.
I agree. Leo, and what about our listeners? What do you think is the most significant difference between the two countries' approaches to taxation, retirement, and social rights?
I'm sure they'll let us know in the comments.
So, that's it for today's topic. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be back with more exciting topics soon. Let's dive into the rate of meeting specific interests in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis. Both countries boast unique cultural experiences and diverse communities that cater to various passions. And to explore the fascinating world of niche hobby clubs and specialized events in these two beautiful nations.
I'm intrigued by the idea of Mozambique's rich cultural heritage influencing the types of events and activities that take place there. From traditional dance performances to modern art exhibitions, I'm curious to see how the country's history and tradition shape its cultural scene.
Exactly. And speaking of cultural heritage, have you heard about the Mozambique National Museum in Maputo? It's an incredible resource for learning about the country's history, art, and culture.
Yes. I've heard great things about the museum. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's a must-visit destination for anyone interested in learning about Mozambique's rich cultural heritage.
That's right. And I'm sure our listeners living in Mozambique would agree that the country's vibrant cultural scene is a major draw for tourists and locals alike. But let's not forget about Saint Kitts and Nevis, which is also known for its unique cultural experiences.
Yes. Saint Kitts and Nevis is a wonderful example of a country that has managed to preserve its cultural heritage while also embracing modernity. From its traditional folk music to its modern art galleries, the country has a lot to offer for those interested in the arts.
I'm particularly interested in learning more about the island's traditional music and dance. Have you heard about the big drum or SEKKLE tradition, which is a unique form of folk music that's been passed down through generations?
Yes. I've heard about it, and it sounds fascinating. The big drum tradition is an important part of Saint Kitts and Nevis's cultural heritage, and it's great to see how the country is working to preserve and promote it.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that preserving cultural heritage is essential for any country. But let's not forget about the importance of community engagement and participation in these cultural events.
Yes. Community engagement is crucial for creating a vibrant cultural scene. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that attending local events and participating in cultural activities is a great way to experience the authentic culture of a country.
That's right. And speaking of community engagement, have you heard about the various volunteer opportunities available in Saint Kitts and Nevis? From conservation efforts to community development projects, there are many ways to get involved and make a difference.
Yes. I've heard about the wonderful work being done by local organizations and volunteers in Saint Kitts and Nevis. It's great to see how the community is coming together to make a positive impact.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this topic. Do you think that community engagement is essential for creating a vibrant cultural scene?
Yes. I think that community engagement is crucial for creating a thriving cultural scene. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that attending local events and participating in cultural activities is a great way to experience the authentic culture of a country.
That's right. And I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree that the unique cultural experiences in diverse communities are a major draw for tourists and locals alike.
Yes. And speaking of unique cultural experiences, have you heard about the various festivals and events that take place in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis? From traditional dance performances to modern art exhibitions, there's always something happening in these two beautiful nations.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that attending these festivals and events is a great way to experience the authentic culture of a country. So, what do you think is the most important aspect of meeting specific interests in these countries?
That's a great question. I think that the most important aspect is community engagement participation. When people come together to share their passions and interests, it creates a vibrant cultural scene that benefits everyone.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that community engagement is essential for creating a thriving cultural scene.
Yes. And speaking of thriving cultural scenes, I'm curious to hear from our listeners about their own experiences with community engagement and cultural events in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Yes. And I'm sure our listeners would love to share their own stories and experiences with meeting specific interests in these countries. So, please do share your thoughts and comments below.
Yes. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to catch our next video and be among the first to listen.
And finally, we'd like to thank our listeners for joining us on this episode of our podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning about the unique cultural experiences and diverse communities in Mozambique and Saint Kitts and Nevis.
Yes. And we hope you'll join us again soon for more episodes of our podcast. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Warmest wishes from us. And this episode, please follow the Jet Off AI YouTube channel for more episodes like this. Hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop and be among the first to listen. We'd love for you to share your thoughts, comments, and critiques below. Reading and responding to them truly brightens our day. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with more. So until then, take care and see you in the next one.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll catch you in the next one.
Until next time, take care and stay awesome.